She didn't knock. She never knocked. That was the first thing that told him something was terribly wrong. The door flew open and there she stood soaking wet. Breathless, her whole body shaking like the storm itself had followed her inside. Clara Whitmore, his neighbor, the woman the whole town called too big, too stubborn, too much. She looked at him with those wide brown eyes and whispered 4 words he never expected. I feel safer here. If you're new to this channel, subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The storm started the way most disasters do in Dakota Territory, quietly. It came in from the north, the way the worst ones always did. Rolling across the flat open land like something that had made up its mind long before anyone on the ground had a chance to prepare. The sky turned that particular shade of green that old-timers recognized and respected. Clouds stacked on top of each other like they were in a hurry to get somewhere. The wind shifted direction twice in 10 minutes, which was never a good sign. Clara Whitmore had been watching that sky for the better part of an hour. She stood on the narrow porch of her farmhouse, the one her father had built with his own hands, back in 1871. The one she had spent the last 4 years keeping upright through sheer stubbornness and a refusal to let the land win, and she watched those clouds the way a person watches something they know is coming for them, specifically. "All right," she said to nobody in particular. "Come on." Then. She was 26 years old, and she had never in her life asked for help she didn't absolutely have to ask for. That was the truth her father had given her, same as he'd given her this land. The way some fathers give their daughters jewelry or fine dresses. He'd given her grit instead. He'd given her the understanding that the world would not be kind to a woman who looked like Clara Whitmore, and that the only currency she had, that nobody could take from her, was the ability to keep going when everything said stop. Clara was not a small woman. She knew it. She had known it since she was 9 years old, and the schoolmaster's wife had looked at her across a church picnic and said, loud enough for half the congregation to hear, that it was a shame about the Whitmore girl because she had such a pretty face. Clara had not cried about it then. She had not cried about it since. But she carried those words the way a person carries a stone in their boot, always aware of it. Always adjusting, never quite free of the weight. At 147 pounds over what Millhaven, Dakota Territory considered acceptable for a woman. Clara Whitmore had learned early that the town had already decided what she was worth. Her father had never agreed with that assessment. He had told her many times that the measure of a person was what they built and what they defended and what they refused to give up on. He had told her that right up until the morning 3 years ago when he'd gone out to check the east fence line and never come back, the heart attack dropping him in the frozen grass like something had simply decided it was done with him. Clara had buried him alone. She had managed the paperwork alone. She had faced down the 3 different men who came around in the weeks after with offers to buy her out, offers that got less polite with each visit entirely alone. And she had kept the Whitmore ranch running, kept the cattle fed, and the fences repaired, and the roof from leaking too badly. Through 2 brutal winters and 1 drought summer. Alone. She was very good at alone. She just hadn't counted on this storm being the kind that tested the structural integrity of every decision she'd ever made. The first thing that went was the east-facing wall of the barn. Clara heard it go from inside the farmhouse, that specific cracking sound of old timber giving way, followed by a deep groan that traveled through the ground and up through the floorboards and into her feet. She was already moving before the second crack came. Pulling on her oilskin coat, grabbing the lantern from the hook by the door, pushing out into the wind before she had time to think clearly about whether that was a good idea. The wind hit her like a physical argument. It pushed against her chest and tried to turn her sideways. And she leaned into it the way she'd learned to lean into everything, with her whole body. With her jaw set, with the stubborn insistence that she was not going to be moved by anything that didn't have the decency to ask first. "Damn it," she said into the wind, which didn't care. She made it to the barn. The east wall had buckled inward. Two of the main support beams cracked at the base, the roof sagging on that side, like it had given up the argument with gravity. Old Bessie, her most reliable milk cow, was making a sound Clara had never heard from her before, low and distressed and almost human in its urgency. "Easy," Clara said, moving to the cow first, checking her legs, checking her sides. "Easy, girl. You're all right. You're all right." She said it with a confidence she did not entirely feel. She spent the next 40 minutes doing what she could, moving the livestock to the more stable west end of the barn, wedging a fallen beam back into position with a length of lumber and the kind of leverage that compensated for what she lacked in height, tying off the loose section of roof with rope she'd run through the high window. Her arms ached. Her back screamed at her. The wind kept up its argument. When she finally stepped back and looked at what she'd managed, she knew it wasn't enough. The roof wouldn't hold another hour in this wind. If the rain came in heavy the way it was going to go, she'd lose the east end entirely, and with it the hay supply she'd spent August building up. And without the hay, she'd be looking at a winter she wasn't sure she could get through. She stood there in the barn doorway, rain driving sideways into her face, and she did something she almost never allowed herself to do. She thought about what she couldn't fix alone. William Carter's property line began approximately a quarter-mile east of the Whitmore fence. He'd bought the old Hendricks place 2 years back, the one everyone in Millhaven had said was too far gone to be worth saving. And he had spent those 2 years quietly proving everyone wrong. He ran a modest cattle operation, kept largely to himself, came into town for supplies every other week with the same calm, unhurried manner that seemed to irritate certain men in Millhaven considerably. Clara knew him the way you know a neighbor you've never spoken to, more than necessity required. She'd seen him at the general store. She'd seen him riding the fence line that bordered her property. Once in the spring, she'd found one of his calves tangled in her wire, and she'd gone to tell him. And he'd thanked her with a quiet directness that she'd appreciated, because it didn't include any of the usual businessmen did when they talked to her, the looking past, the looking over, the careful way of pretending they hadn't already decided she wasn't worth full attention. He'd just said, "Thank you, Miss Whitmore. I'll come get him directly," and he had. And that had been the extent of their relationship. She'd told herself she'd rather keep it that way. Pride, she had learned, was armor. It wasn't always comfortable armor, but it was the only kind she had. She was back inside, calculating what the hay loss would cost her, when the second thing went wrong. The sound was different from the barn, sharper, more immediate. Directly overhead, the farmhouse roof had been a concern all summer. She knew that. She'd patched the worst sections in June and told herself she'd get to the rest in September. And September had not yet arrived, and now something in the northwest corner was giving way with a sound like a rifle shot, followed by a sustained tearing that made her stomach drop. The ceiling in the back bedroom opened up. Rain came through in a sheet. Clara stood in the doorway of that room and watched it come in and felt something she was not accustomed to feeling. Not panic. She didn't panic. She'd trained herself out of it the way a person trains a bad habit out of a horse, firmly and repeatedly until the response changed. What she felt was closer to the cold arithmetic of a person counting resources and coming up short. She counted what she had. She counted what was failing. She counted the distance between those two things. She went to the window and looked east toward the Carter property. She stood there for a long time. "No," she said. She went and got every pot and bucket she owned and arranged them under the leak. She went up to the attic with a hammer and a handful of nails and tried to tack down the section of roofing felt that had pulled loose. And the wind pulled it loose again before she'd gotten 2 nails in. And she drove a nail through her palm in the process, not deeply, but enough to bleed, enough to make the hammer slippery. She came back down. She stood in the front room and looked at her hands, one bleeding, both trembling from cold and exertion, and she looked at the ceiling where she could hear water pooling now, the weight of it building, and she thought about the structural integrity of the beams above her, and she thought about the winter hay, and she thought about 3 years of doing this alone, and she thought about her father saying, "The measure of a person is what they refuse to give up on." She put on her coat. She went out into the storm. She hadn't planned what she was going to say. That was evident from the fact that when William Carter opened his door lantern in hand, already dressed like a man who'd been awake, listening to the storm, she stood there on his porch dripping water in every direction and said absolutely nothing for a full 4 seconds. He didn't say anything either. He just looked at her with those steady gray eyes that didn't do the thing eyes usually did when they looked at Clara Whitmore. He didn't look at her body first. He just looked at her face. The way a person looks at another person. "Miss Whitmore," he said. Calm, steady, like she was not soaking wet and bleeding and showing up unannounced in the middle of a storm. "My roof," Clara said. The words came out stripped down. Nothing extra. The northwest section came in. The barn wall is cracked. I've got livestock that need to be moved and a ceiling that's going to come down before morning if someone doesn't." She stopped. Pressed her lips together. Try need the word. Stuck. She had said it in her mind on the walkover. She'd rehearsed it the way you rehearse something. You know you're going to say wrong. "I need help." Simple, practical 3 words. She had said harder things in her life. She had identified her father's body to the county sheriff. She had told 3 different men to get off her land using language that had made the last one turn red from the collar up. She had not cried at the funeral because there had been nobody there who deserved her tears. 3 words. She couldn't get them out. "Your roof came in," William said. "The northwest corner," she confirmed. "The barn wall cracked on the east side. I've secured the livestock as best I can, but the hay. Is the house structurally sound?" "I believe so." "The damage is localized to is your hand all right?" She looked down. She had forgotten about the nail. The blood had mixed with the rain and was running down her wrist in a thin pink line. She pulled her hand back, instinct, the same way she always pulled back when someone noticed a weakness. "It's nothing," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Come inside." "I don't need Miss Whitmore." He said her name the same way he'd said it the first time, not unkindly. Not impatiently, just directly. "You're bleeding in my rain. Come inside for a moment. Then we'll see about your roof." His house was warmer than she'd expected. Not fancy, nothing in this part of Dakota Territory was fancy, but orderly in the way she respected. The way that said a person took care of what they had. There was a fire going in the main hearth, which told her he'd been up. There were books stacked on the table next to a half-empty coffee mug. She stood in the middle of his front room and dripped on his floorboards and tried to remember the last time she'd been inside someone else's house. She couldn't. He came back with a cloth and a small tin of salve that smelled like something medicinal. And she almost told him she didn't need it, and then she looked at her hand, which had bled more than she'd realized, and she kept her mouth shut. He took her hand, not asking, just taking it, matter of fact. Like tending to someone's injury was a normal thing that normal people did for each other. Which she supposed it was, and he pressed the cloth against the cut and held it there. "I told you it was nothing." "You did," he agreed. And kept the cloth where it was. She looked away from him. Looked at the books on his table. One of them had a strip of leather, marking a page about 2/3 of the way through. "Cattle management," she said. "History," he said. "Rome." She hadn't expected that. She looked back at him. "You read about Rome," she said. "When the work's done." He glanced up at her briefly. "You sound surprised." "I'm not," she said, which wasn't entirely true. Most people out here don't. Most people out here have decided what a cowboy reads," he said. "Same as they've decided most things about most people." He tied off a strip of cloth around her hand. "Neat. Efficient. Didn't make a production of it. You've got a good roof up there otherwise?" "Just the one section?" "Just the northwest corner. But the roofing felt pulled away from about a 6-foot section, and if the rain gets under the boards." We'll lose the interior ceiling below it. He was already moving toward where his coat hung on the wall. What about the barn beam? How far cracked? 2 feet up from the base on both the east supports. I've got lumber I can use to sister them if I have access to the upper loft to secure the top. He stopped and looked at her. You know how to sister a beam, he said. Not a question exactly. Something else. My father built this ranch board by board, Clara said. He didn't see any reason I shouldn't know how. Something in William Carter's expression shifted. Not dramatically, he wasn't a man who did things dramatically. She was already understanding that. It was subtle. The way a door opens a crack, and you can see there's light on the other side, without being able to see the whole room. He sounds like he was a smart man, William said. He was, Clara said. She didn't say anything else about it. There wasn't anything else to say. They went back out into the storm together. There was no ceremony about it. He pulled on his coat, grabbed his lantern and a coil of rope from the hook near the door, and walked out with the matter-of-fact purposefulness of a man who had decided a thing needed doing and had therefore moved on to the question of how. Clara walked beside him, not behind him. She noticed that he adjusted his pace without being asked, not in a way that called attention to itself. Just a subtle shift, a man who paid attention. The wind had picked up since she'd walked over. The rain was fully committed now, the kind of rain that came in sheets and made the world into a series of moving curtains. Her lantern flickered and held. His did the same. The barn first, she said. Agreed, he said. The east wall, I'll see it when we get there. He wasn't dismissing her. She recognized the difference, had spent years learning the difference between a man who interrupted because he wasn't listening and a man who was already listening so fully that he'd moved on to thinking. William Carter, she was beginning to understand, was the second kind. They reached the barn. He held his lantern up and looked at the cracked supports without saying anything for a moment. Then you got those boards in already? 2 of them. There's more in the storage shed on the south side. Show me. She showed him. He assessed the lumber, selected the pieces without commentary, carried them back to the barn with an ease that came from years of physical work. He moved efficiently and without waste, which she respected on a practical level, entirely separate from the fact that she could not entirely stop noticing that he was a very capable-looking man in the lamplight of her barn. She filed that observation away and paid it no further attention. They worked the beams together her on the upper end, securing the top of the sisters to the roof plate while he bolted the bases. She discovered that he had a habit of telling her what he was about to do before he did it, which meant she never got caught off guard by a shift in tension or weight. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing that made the difference between a dangerous job and a manageable one. Ready on my end, she called down. Ready, he confirmed, and drove the bolt home with 3 clean strikes that she felt through the timber. The east wall was stable. It had taken them 45 minutes. She had estimated 2 hours alone. The roof was harder. Working at height in a wind like this one was the kind of task that asked hard questions about trust. Who was holding the rope? Who was watching the edge? Who was paying attention to what the other person needed before they needed to ask for it? Clara had worked at height alone before. She had her own methods, her own ways of managing the rope and the angle, and the problem of having nobody to call to if something went wrong. Having William Carter on the other end of the rope was a different kind of problem entirely. I've got you, he said. From below, the rope held steady. Not you're fine or don't worry, or any of the things people said when they meant calm down. Just I've got you, factual, present. She worked the section of roofing felt back into place, driving nails through in a pattern her father had taught her, overlapping against the rain, running a bead of pitch along the upper edge where the wind had pulled the sealant loose. The wind argued with her. She argued back. The nails went in. She called down, pulling up the tar paper. I've got you, he said again. Same tone. She worked until the section was as secure as she could make it in the dark with the rain still coming. Not perfect, but it would hold. That was the standard she had always worked to, not perfect but holding. Not ideal but sufficient, the minimum needed to make it to morning and assess in the light. When she came down, he was coiling the rope with the same unhurried competence he'd done everything else. She stood beside him and looked up at what they'd done. "It'll hold until morning," she said. "Then in the morning we'll do it right," he said. She looked at him. "You don't have to, Miss Whitmore." He finished coiling the rope, draped it over his shoulder, looked at her directly. "I'm not doing you a favor. I'm doing what a neighbor does." He paused. There's a difference. She had spent 3 years making sure she didn't need anyone. She had built that independence board by board, the same way her father had built the farmhouse. With intention and care, and the understanding that it was the only thing standing between her and the mercy of a world that didn't particularly intend to be merciful. She had been proud of it. She was still proud of it. But standing here in the rain with the roof holding above her and the barn secure, and a man who had come out in a storm because it was what a neighbor did, she felt something shift in the architecture of that independence. Not collapse, not fail, just shift. The way a structure settles and finds its true foundation. "I know the difference," she said quietly. He nodded. No more needed on the subject, back inside. He accepted the coffee she made. She felt it was the minimum she could offer without it being and he sat at her table with the same ease he'd moved through the rest of the evening. Comfortable in his own body and in the space, without needing to fill either with anything unnecessary. "Your father homesteaded this land?" he asked. 1871, she said. "He came from Ohio. He was 23 years old. And he had $40 and a bad horse." She set his cup in front of him. He said the horse got better. The corner of his mouth moved. "The $40 less reliable." She sat across from him. It was strange, not unpleasant, but strange to have someone at this table. She could not remember the last time anyone had sat at this table with her. "You've run this place alone since he passed," William said. It was not a question. 3 years, she said. "The whole town thought you'd sell. The whole town thinks a great many things." She wrapped her hands around her own cup. "They thought I couldn't manage a cattle operation. They thought I'd fold on the north pasture after the first winter. They thought." She stopped herself. "The town has been wrong about me for a long time. I've stopped keeping score." "Have you?" he said. Not challenging. Not quite believing either. She looked at him. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means," he said, carefully, "that a person who's truly stopped keeping score doesn't usually mention all the ways the town was wrong." He said it without any judgment in it. The way he seemed to do most things, just stating what was true and letting the other person decide what to do with it. "I don't say that unkindly." Clara was quiet for a moment. "No," she said finally. "I don't imagine you do outside." The storm was beginning to ease. She could hear it in the change of the rain's pattern against the windows, from the frantic driving sheets to something more resigned, more ordinary, a storm that had spent what it had and was now just finishing up. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask," he said. "Why did you come out tonight?" She paused. Chosen her words. "I didn't ask properly. I showed up at your door and I could barely get the words out, and you just..." She stopped again. "Why wouldn't I?" he said. "Because most people wouldn't. Because I'm..." She felt the familiar tightening, the automatic calculation of what she was and wasn't allowed to claim. "Because people in this town have a fairly fixed idea of what I'm worth, and it doesn't generally include Miss Whitmore." His voice was quiet, but it stopped her the way a firmly placed hand stops a gate swinging in the wind. "I'm not most people in this town." She looked at him across the table. "No," she said. "I'm starting to see that." He finished his coffee, set the cup down, stood up without making a thing of it. "I'll be back at first light," he said. "We'll do the roof properly. And the east barn wall could use a crossbrace if you've got the lumber." "I have the lumber," she said. "Then we'll do it right." He took his coat from the hook by her door. She had hung it there without thinking when they'd come in. An instinct so automatic it had bypassed her usual guardedness entirely, and he put it on. Get some sleep, Miss Whitmore. Clara, she said. He stopped. I've been thinking of you as William Carter all evening, she said. It seems excessive at this point. Something in his face did the thing it had done earlier, that subtle opening. That door cracking to the light. Good night, Clara, he said. Good night, she said. She stood in her doorway and watched him walk back through the thinning rain toward his own property, the lantern making a small steady light in the dark. And she thought about her father saying that the measure of a person was what they built and what they defended and what they refused to give up on. She had spent 3 years understanding that to mean she had to do it all herself. She was beginning to wonder, standing here in the door of the farmhouse her father had built with his hands, if maybe she had been applying the lesson to the wrong question. She went to bed with the storm settling into quiet around the farmhouse and the roof holding above her head. And she lay in the dark and listened to the last of the rain and thought about the way William Carter had said "I've got you" while she worked in the dark on the roof. Not "you're fine," not "don't worry, I've got you." She had not had anyone say that to her in 3 years. She had not realized until this moment that she had been waiting for it, without knowing she was waiting. In the morning, he'd be back to do the roof properly. That was a practical matter. That was just what neighbors did. She closed her eyes. Outside, the storm was almost finished. The land would need to be assessed at first light, the full accounting of what was lost and what had held. She was good at that kind of accounting. She had been doing it alone for 3 years. Tomorrow she would not be doing it alone. She was still deciding what to do with that fact when sleep found her. He came back before sunrise. Clara heard the horse before she saw the lantern, the sound of hooves on the wet ground outside. Unhurried, deliberate, the way William Carter did everything. She had been awake for an hour already, sitting at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee, going through the list she'd written in the dark. The list was not short. She had made herself write every item without flinching, because flinching had never once fixed a fence, or patched a roof, or kept a cattle operation running through a Dakota winter. She heard him tie off the horse. She heard his boots on the porch steps. He knocked this time 2 knocks, firm and even. When she opened the door, he was standing there in the gray pre-dawn light with a toolbox in one hand and a wrapped bundle in the other. And he looked at her the way he had looked at her last night, which was to say he looked at her face first and stood there. "You're already up," he said. "I don't sleep past 4, she said. "Come in." He came in and set the toolbox near the door and put the wrapped bundle on the table. It was a wax paper parcel tied with kitchen string. She could smell it before she asked. "Biscuits," he said. "I had the dough from yesterday." She looked at the parcel, then at him. "You brought me breakfast," she said. "I brought food," he said, taking off his coat, hanging it where she hadn't told him to hang it, but where it made sense to hang it. "Whether it's breakfast or whether it's just biscuits is up to you." She put a third cup on the table. She had not planned to do that. Her hands just did it. They ate standing up, the way working people eat when there's work to be done. And she walked him through her list while he ate the roof section, the barn wall brace, the section of fencing on the north edge that the storm had knocked sideways, the drainage trench on the east side of the property that had backed up and was now threatening to flood the root cellar. She had ranked them by urgency, and she laid them out in that order. And he listened without interrupting, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he listened. "The trench is a 2-person job," he said when she'd finished. "I know it," she said. "The roof first," he said. "Then the trench, the barn wall. The barn wall will hold another day." It held all night. He finished the last biscuit. The root cellar won't wait. She had already come to the same conclusion. She had just been waiting to see if he would. "All right," she said. "The roof first." He picked up his cup, finished the coffee, set it in the sink with the same practical tidiness she was noticing he brought to everything. Then he picked up the toolbox and said, "Show me the roof in full light." She showed him. The northwest section, in the morning light, was worse than she'd been able to assess in the storm. The roofing felt had torn away from a section nearly 8 feet wide. Not the 6 she'd estimated. 3 of the underlying boards were cracked. One had a split that went halfway through the timber and would need to be replaced entirely. Not sistered. William stood beside her and looked at it without speaking for a moment. "The board needs to come out," he said. "I know. You have replacement stock in the shed." "I've been saving boards from the—" She paused. "From the section my father started adding on before he got sick." The wood seasoned. He looked at her sideways, just briefly. "Good," he said. "That'll be stronger than new cut." He didn't say anything else about the addition that never got finished. She was grateful for that in a way she didn't entirely have words for. They went to work. This was different from the night before. Different in the way that daylight made everything different. You could see what you were doing. You could see each other, and Clara found that seeing him work was a kind of education she hadn't anticipated. He was methodical without being slow. He made decisions without consulting her unnecessarily, and he consulted her exactly when he should, when it was her property. Her materials, her judgment that was needed. He didn't explain things to her she already knew. He asked what she preferred when there were 2 ways to do something that were equally good. She had worked alongside men before. In the years before her father died, hired hands. Mostly, who had either ignored her entirely or managed her with a careful condescension she'd learned to navigate around. William Carter did neither of those things. He just worked. And he worked with her the way a person works, alongside someone they've decided is competent. She was beginning to understand the most disorienting thing anyone had done for her in years. "Hand me the pry bar," he said from above, and she handed it up without thinking about it. And he worked the cracked board loose and handed it back down. And she carried it clear of the work area, and the whole exchange had the rhythm of something practiced, a rhythm they had not earned and should not yet have had. She thought about that while she carried the board to the scrap pile. She turned the thought over a few times. She set it aside the way you set aside something you don't have an answer for yet. They replaced the board. They ran new roofing felt over the section, overlapping properly, sealing the edges with pitch. She was on the roof for the second half of it, and he was below. And when she called down ready for the final course, he said ready, and she laid the last row of felt and drove the nails in clean, and it was done. She came down. "That'll hold a winter," he said. "It better," she said. "I'm not doing that again until spring." He looked at her with that almost thing that was almost a smile. "Probably wise," he said. They moved to the drainage trench. This was the harder work, the wet ground, the backed-up water that had been sitting since the storm. The physical effort of clearing the trench and extending it properly to redirect the flow away from the root cellar foundation. Clara had done trench work before, and she knew exactly what it cost, in terms of her back and her arms, and the particular kind of mud that sucked at your boots and made every step twice the effort. She had been dreading this one on the list all morning. She did not say that. She picked up a shovel. William picked up the other one. They worked in a silence that was not uncomfortable. She had been in enough silences with people to know the difference, the kind of silence that is actually a conversation going badly. And the kind of silence that means 2 people have found a working rhythm and don't need words to maintain it. This was the second kind. After a while he said, without stopping his work, "How long have you had the cattle operation?" "My father started it," she said. 20 head when he came out. We were at 60 by the time he died. I've brought it to 83, he stopped, just for a beat. Then he kept going. You added 23 head in 3 years. Alone, 24, she said. I lost one in the first winter, still, he said. Still what? That's not a small thing, he said. Most people don't understand how not small that is. She drove her shovel into the mud and turned it and said, most people in this town have a story they've already decided about me. Adding facts to a story people have already decided tends not to change the story.
He was quiet for a moment.
Then what story have they decided? She laughed. It came out short and dry and entirely genuine. That I'm a woman who should have sold when she had the chance, and that whatever I've managed to do on this land, I've done by luck or by stubbornness past the point of sense. Not because I know what I'm doing. And which is it, he said. Luck or stubbornness? She looked at him. Neither, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. No, he agreed. Neither. They went back to work. The trench began to clear. The water found its new direction and moved with it. The way water always moved toward the path that worked, without sentiment about what it was leaving behind. She was thinking about that when she heard the horses. 3 of them, coming up the main road from the direction of town. She knew the horses before she could make out the riders. You learn to know horses out here, the way you learn to know most things that mattered. The bay at the front belonged to Gerald Hackett, who owned the Millhaven Mercantile and had come out to her property twice in the past 3 years with a prepared document and a sympathetic expression and an offer to take the whole thing off her hands for a figure that went down each time. The gray behind him was Ed Browers, who ran the town's only bank and had denied her application for operating credit the previous spring without stating an explicit reason, which had not required a stated reason because the unstated one was sufficiently clear. She didn't recognize the third horse. "You're expecting company?" William said from beside her. "No," she said. She straightened up, set the shovel, wiped her hands on her work pants. "No, I am not." Gerald Hackett pulled up 10 feet short of where she was standing, which was exactly the kind of distance a man keeps when he wants to be in a position of looking down at you. He had that prepared sympathetic expression already arranged on his face, which meant he'd put it on before he'd even gotten here. And that told her what kind of conversation this was going to be before he opened his mouth. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "we heard you had some storm damage last night." "Quite a bad one, from the look of it." He glanced at the barn. He glanced at the roof. He let his gaze travel the property with the careful interest of a man doing an appraisal. "Tragic about this place. My place is—" "Mr. Hackett," she said, "the storm damage has been addressed." His eyes found William Carter standing beside her, and something shifted behind them, a quick recalculation. "Mr. Carter," he said with a different kind of nod. The kind of nod men gave each other when they were in the business of deciding things. "Didn't realize you had an interest out this way." "I'm a neighbor," William said. His voice had gone very flat and very even. Neighbors help each other after a storm. Hackett smiled the smile of a man who has decided that what he's looking at is simpler than it appears. Of course. He looked back at Clara. "The thing is, Miss Whitmore, this kind of storm damage, this kind of thing adds up. And we've been worried about you, the town has. A single woman managing all this." He gestured broadly at the property. "There's no shame in recognizing when a situation has become well unmanageable." Clara looked at him steadily. "What has become unmanageable, Mr. Hackett?" Well, he shifted on the horse. "The roof, the barn, and I imagine the fencing took damage too." "And that drainage situation has been repaired," Clara said. "This morning. By me." Hackett's smile stayed in place, but something behind his eyes did the calculation again. "Be that as it may, we, that is, myself and Mr. Brower here, we've put together what we think is quite a fair offer. Given the current state of things, given that you've been managing alone for some time now." "You came the morning after a storm," Clara said, "to make me an offer." "You came the morning after a storm," she said again. Slower, clearer, before the ground is even dry, because you thought the storm might have done what 3 years of your concern hasn't managed to do. She looked at Brower, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. She looked back at Hackett, who did not. "The answer is the same as it has been. This land belonged to my father. He built it. I have run it. I intend to keep running it. That is not going to change because of one storm or because of 3 men on horses who have decided it should." Hackett's smile had gone away. "Miss Whitmore, she's given you her answer," William said. Hackett looked at him. "This is between me and Miss Whitmore," Hackett said. if you don't mind. I do mind, William said simply. When someone isn't listening, he hadn't moved, hadn't changed his posture, hadn't raised his voice. He just said it the same way he said everything, like he'd already decided it was true and was simply making it available to anyone who wanted to know. She's given you her answer. I heard it clearly. I reckon you did too. The third rider, the one Clara didn't recognize, shifted in his saddle and looked at the other two with an expression suggested he had not been told this errand was going to go this particular direction. Ed Brower cleared his throat. Gerald, he said. Hackett held William's gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he looked back at Clara, and the sympathetic expression was gone now. And what was underneath it was what Clara had always suspected was underneath it, not concern. Not civic-mindedness, but a particular kind of appetite. The kind that presents itself as helpfulness, because that's the polite word for it. This land is going to be more trouble than you can handle, he said. Sooner or later, Mr. Hackett, Clara said. Every year for 3 years you've told me some version of that. Every year for 3 years I'm still here. She picked up her shovel. Good morning to you. Hackett looked at her once more. Then at William. Then he pulled his horse around, and the three of them went back down the road the way they'd come. And Clara watched them go, and stood very still until she was entirely certain they were not going to turn around. Then she let out a breath. That's the second time this spring, she said. Last time he brought a different fellow from the bank. He'll come again, William said. I know it. She went back to the trench. He always does. William was quiet for a moment. Then, do you have documentation of your cattle numbers? Your operating records? She looked at him sideways. I have 4 years of ledgers, every head, every season. Every cost and every return, he nodded slowly. Keep them somewhere he can't reach. They're in my father's safe, she said. Built into the floor under the kitchen table. Hackett doesn't know it exists, and I intend to keep it that way. Something in William's expression shifted again that door. Cracking open. Your father built a hidden floor safe in a farmhouse in Dakota Territory, he said. My father, Clara said, did not trust banks. William Carter looked at her for a long moment, and then he laughed. It was a real laugh, not polite, not managed to full. Sudden thing that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. She stared at him. What? Nothing, he said. Still with the tail end of it in his voice. Just he shook his head. Your father sounds like a man I would have liked to know. Clara looked away. The trench. The mud, the steady work of it. He would have liked you too, she said quietly. He was particular about people. He didn't like most of them. She paused. He would have liked you. They finished the trench in another hour. The water was moving the way it should, away from the foundation, draining out toward the low ground at the edge of the property. Clara covered the main section with the boarding she'd been meaning to put down for 2 seasons. And William held the boards steady while she nailed them. And neither of them mentioned Gerald Hackett again. They ate the last of the biscuits at noon, standing at the fence line, looking at the north pasture where 3 of the boards had gone down. Clara had already estimated the lumber she'd need. She had already calculated whether she had it in stock. She did barely. I have the boards for the fence, she said. I can do that myself tomorrow. I know you can, he said. I'm not saying I know, he said. I'm just saying I know you can. He looked out at the pasture. I'll be here anyway. If you want another set of hands. She chewed on that for a moment. You have your own fences to check, she said. I checked them at first light, he said. Before I came here, she looked at him. You checked your own property before sunrise, so you could come help me. He looked back at her. I checked my property so I knew the state of it, he said. I came here because there was work that needed doing. That's a distinction without much difference. William. Maybe, he said. Or maybe the difference is the part that matters. She thought about that. She turned it over and looked at its other sides. Why, she said. Not challenging. Genuinely asking. You don't owe me anything. We've spoken maybe 4 times in 2 years. I came to your door in the middle of a storm and barely managed to get 3 words out. And she stopped. Why? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then my father had a place outside of Abilene. Not big, 120 acres. Good land. He looked at the horizon. He died when I was 19. My mother was still alive. My 2 sisters. He paused. There was a man named Cole Whitfield who had been watching that land for 2 years. Waiting. He showed up 6 days after my father's funeral. He was very sympathetic. He was very concerned. His voice had not changed its pitch, but the flatness in it had deepened into something harder. My mother sold to him for 1/3 of what the land was worth, because she didn't know what else to do, and there was nobody there to tell her she had time to think. Clara said nothing. I was in Abilene when it happened, he said, working for wages. I didn't know until it was done. He picked up his water canteen. Set it down. I've had a particular feeling about men like Gerald Hackett ever since. Clara looked at the road where Hackett's horses had gone. I'm sorry, she said, about your family's land. It was a long time ago, he said. That doesn't always make it smaller, she said. He looked at her. The door opened a little wider than it had before. No, he said, it doesn't. The afternoon light was shifting by the time they walked back toward the house, that particular gold of late summer that made the Dakota Territory look like it had been designed by someone who understood. That beauty and hardship were not mutually exclusive. That in fact the hardest places often held the most of it. Clara had always loved that light. Her father had called it the honest hour, the time of day when the land showed you what it actually was. Stripped of morning optimism and evening kindness. She stopped at the porch steps. You should stay for supper, she said. The words were out before she'd made any decision to say them. She heard them land in the air between them and did not take them back. Because taking them back would have been a retreat she hadn't earned and didn't want. I have a decent pot of beans on the stove and cornbread. It's not. She stopped the qualifier before it got fully formed. She had a habit of pre-apologizing for things that didn't require apology. You should stay. He looked at her for a moment. Then I'll put the tools away, he said. She went inside and stirred the beans and sliced the cornbread and set the table for 2 and did not think too carefully about any of it. He came in when she called, washed his hands at the basin without being told where it was. Sat down at the table in the same chair he'd occupied that morning, and took the plate she handed him with a quiet, thank you. Clara, that was entirely without performance or ceremony. They ate. After a while he said, tell me about the cattle operation. The specifics, she told him. She told him about the 3 Hereford bulls she'd invested in the previous spring, the calculated risk of that investment, the breeding program she'd designed, based on a combination of her father's records and 2 agricultural pamphlets she'd ordered from Chicago and read until the pages were soft. She told him about her plan to expand the herd to 110 head by the following autumn, and why she'd chosen that number specifically, and what the market in Sioux Falls was showing for beef prices in the coming season. He asked questions. Not simple questions, the kind that were actually statements in disguise. The kind that assumed incompetence and dressed it up as curiosity. Real questions. The kind that came from actually listening. You've been tracking the Sioux Falls prices yourself, he said. I have a contact at the telegraph office, she said. He sends me the weekly report. You pay him for that? Trade. I supply his wife with milk through the winter. He nodded slowly. That's smart. It's practical, she said. The 2 aren't different, he said. She ate for a moment. Then what about your operation? You've got what, 980 head? He looked up. You've been counting. I've been observing, she said. I observe things that happen near my property line. That's not counting, that's attention. The corner of his mouth again. 94. I'm running a different breeding strategy than you. I've been crossing the Herefords with some shorthorn stock for the cold tolerance. How's that going? Better than I expected, he said. The first crosses through well, I lost 2 to a bad spring. But the rest, he described the results with the same specific, detailed knowledge she'd used, the kind that only came from being out in the field with the animals every day. From tracking every outcome and learning from the ones that went wrong. She listened. She had not had a conversation like this in 3 years. She had not realized until right now, sitting across this table from William Carter in the honest gold of the late afternoon, that she had been starving for it. Not for company exactly, she had managed without company. Not for help, she had managed without that too. For this specifically. The particular nourishment of someone who looked at what she was doing and saw it clearly, without the distortion of what they'd already decided she should be. She put down her fork. "William," she said. He looked at her. "I want to say something, and I need you to just let me say it without—" She paused. "Without being gracious about it. Can you do that?" He set down his own fork. "I can try," he said. "What you've done the past 24 hours, she said. "Showing up last night and again this morning, and staying all day and not once." She pressed her lips together. "Not once doing that thing people do, where they help you, but they make sure you know it. Where the help comes with something attached." She looked at him directly. "I haven't had that before. I don't know what to do with it. I'm telling you that plainly, because I think you're a person who prefers plain things." He was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate the plain thing," he said. "Good. I'll say something plain back." Then she waited. "You've been running this operation alone for 3 years because you had to," he said. "And you've done it well. Better than most people would have. But somewhere in there," he paused, "somewhere in there, the having to became the point. Doing it alone stopped being a circumstance and started being a proof." She held very still. "Proof of what?" she said, quiet. "That you're worth something," he said. "That you're enough, that the things this town has said about you." He didn't name those things. He didn't need to. "That they're wrong." The evening light moved across the table between them. "Are they wrong?" she said. "Clara." He said her name the way he always said it, like it had weight. Like it was the whole sentence. "You extended a failing cattle operation by 30%. You secured your own financing outside of a bank that wouldn't give it to you. You kept this land through 2 bad winters and a drought. You fixed your own roof in a storm." He leaned forward. "Just slightly. They're not just wrong. They never had the first idea what they were looking at." She looked at her hands on the table. Her working hands. The bandage he'd wrapped around the cut from the nail. "I'm not telling you this so you'll stop proving it," he said. "You don't need to stop. I'm telling you so you know the proof is already in." He paused. "The verdict's already in, Clara. Has been for a while." She didn't say anything. She sat with the weight of that for a long moment. And the weight of it was not what she'd expected, not heavy the way the things you've been afraid of are heavy when they finally land. But something else. Something closer to what the ground feels like after you've been carrying something for a long time, and you set it down, and the earth takes the weight instead. "You're going to complicate my life, William Carter," she said finally. His expression did the thing it had been doing all day, that quiet opening. "I expect you'll complicate mine right back," he said. Outside, the honest light was going gold to amber. Amber toward the deep blue that came before dark. The Dakota Territory settling into its evening self. Vast and indifferent and privately beautiful. Inside, they finished supper. They did the dishes the way people do dishes when there are 2 of them, one washing, one drying, passing things back and forth in the easy rhythm of a practice they have not yet had enough time to establish, and yet somehow already have. He left before dark. He said good night at the door, and she said good night back, and after his horse had gone down the road, she stood on the porch for a long time, looking at her land in the last of the light. Everything the storm had broken had been fixed. And something else, something she had no name for yet. Something she'd spent 3 years, making sure she didn't leave room for, had opened up quietly in the space the repairs had left behind. She went inside. She sat down at her father's table and opened the ledger and looked at the numbers, which were good, were better than good, were the product of 4 years of decisions that had been right more than they'd been wrong. She picked up her pen, and next to the entry for the day, next to the column where she tracked labor and time and materials, she wrote 2 words in her careful, precise hand, "Not alone." Then she closed the ledger and went to bed. And for the first time in 3 years, she did not lie awake, thinking about everything that still needed to be done. The week after the storm was the kind of week that tested whether a thing was real or whether it was just the storm talking. Clara had seen it before, not with people, but with the land itself. After a bad night, everything looked different in the morning. Fences that had held looked fragile. Ground that had been solid looked unreliable. You spent the first clear day walking the property and reassessing, asking yourself whether what you were seeing was the truth or just the leftover fear of the night before. She applied the same method to William Carter. He came back Tuesday to help with the north fence, the way he'd said he would. He came back Thursday with a load of gravel for the drainage trench cover, which she hadn't asked for and which was exactly the right grade. He didn't make a ceremony of either visit. He showed up. He worked. He left when the work was done. He drank coffee when she made it, and he ate when there was food and he did not. At any point, behave as though any of this required her gratitude at a volume that would be inconvenient to provide. She watched him the way she watched everything she was trying to understand carefully, without announcing that she was doing it. What she saw was a man who meant what he said and said what he meant and did not appear to spend any significant time managing the distance between those two things. It was, she had come to understand, a rarer quality than it should have been. By Friday, she had stopped waiting for the catch. That was when Gerald Hackett made his second move. She found out about it the way she found out about most things in Millhaven, not because anyone told her directly, but because Dora Sims at the dry goods store had a habit of talking to Clara like she was continuing a conversation that had already been started, which meant Clara had learned to pay attention to the middle of sentences. "Of course I told my husband it wasn't right, not a week after the storm. But you know how Gerald gets when he's decided something," Dora said, wrapping Clara's order of flour without looking up. And Ed Brower going along with it like he always does. "What specifically did Gerald decide?" Clara said, her voice very level. Dora looked up. She had the expression of someone who has realized they may have said more than they intended and was now calculating the fastest way through the rest of it. "Well, the water rights," she said, "on the creek. Gerald's been talking to the county land office about the designation of the creek as a, I don't know the word exactly, a shared resource, he called it, which would mean any owner along the creek line could petition to redirect the flow," Clara said. "I think that's the gist of it, yes." Clara paid for her flour. She picked up her parcels. She said, "Thank you, Dora," in a tone that was entirely controlled and entirely meant. She drove the wagon home, and she went straight to her father's desk, and she pulled out the original land deed and the survey documents that went with it, and she sat down and she read every word of the water rights section with the focused attention of a person who has just been told the ground might not be where they thought it was. The creek ran along the eastern edge of her property for approximately 600 yards. Her cattle depended on it through the summer months. Without it, she could manage. She had the well and the stock pond, but the stock pond ran low in a dry August, and the well was not sufficient for 83 head in the heat. The creek was not incidental. The creek was foundational. And the language in the deed, she could see now, was not as clear as it should have been. Her father had known the land. He had not known, apparently, that the language a man used to describe what he owned mattered as much as the owning. She sat at the desk for a long time. Then she went to the window and looked east toward the Carter property line. And then she looked at the clock. And then she made a decision she was not entirely comfortable with and went to saddle her horse. William was at the fence line nearest the road when she came up. He saw her coming from 50 yards out and he waited. the way he always waited still, attentive, not making a production of anything. She pulled up and said without preamble, "Do you know about the water rights petition?" He looked at her steadily. "When did you hear?" "Dora Sims." She watched his face. "You already knew." "I heard something Wednesday," he said. "I wasn't certain enough to William." She said his name the way he'd taught her to say hers, with weight, with the whole sentence in it. "If you hear something that touches my land, I need you to tell me, even if you're not certain." He held her gaze. "You're right," he said. "I should have." She had been prepared to be angry about it, and his saying so directly took the anger off somewhere she couldn't use it. "What did you hear?" she said instead. "That Hackett's been talking to someone at the county office. A surveyor named Aldous. Hackett and Brower have property to the north of the creek, not much. Some scrubland they've been sitting on, and if they can get the creek reclassified, they can petition for a shared use designation, which gives them legal standing to draw from it. And if they draw from it," Clara said, "my summer allocation drops. And if it drops enough in a dry year, my herd numbers become unsustainable." She said it flatly, out loud, the way she made herself say hard things. "Name the problem clearly. Don't let it grow bigger in the dark." "This is not about the water," she said. "No," William said. "It's about making the land less viable so the offer looks more attractive." "He couldn't get me out with sympathy," she said. "So now he's trying to get me out with math." She looked at the fence line. The eastern pasture, the property she had spent 3 years fighting to keep. Something hard and hot moved through her chest. "He's going to find out that I'm better at math than he is." William looked at her for a moment. "What do you need?" he said. "I need to know if your deed has the same water language mine does," she said. "Because your eastern boundary also touches the creek. If they reclassify it, you're affected too." He was already turning back toward his property. "Come look at it," he said. They spread both deeds on William's kitchen table and read them side by side, and the problem became immediately clear and immediately worse. Both documents used similar language, vague, the kind of vague that had been acceptable in 1871, when there was enough water for everyone, and no one had imagined a scenario where someone would try to carve the rights up and redistribute them. The kind of vague that a smart lawyer in front of a sympathetic judge could do considerable damage with. "We need someone who knows land law," William said. "There's no one in Millhaven," Clara said. "Sioux Falls," he said. "There's a firm there, Morrison and Hatch. They handled a water dispute 2 counties over last year. I know a man who used them." "How?" Clara said. He looked at her. "Does it matter?" "Of course it matters." "I have a budget, William, and it'll cover the initial consultation," he said. "You will not," she said immediately. No pause between the words. "Clara, no." She said it quietly, but the quietness of it was not softness. "I am not going to handle one man trying to take what's mine by letting another man pay for my defense. I will find the money. What I need from you right now is the name of the firm." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Morrison and Hatch. Ask for Daniel Morrison specifically. Tell him the Carter recommendation." "Thank you," she said. She folded her deed and picked it up. "I mean it." "I know you do," he said. "That's not why I told you." She rode into Sioux Falls the following Monday. She had the money. She'd pulled it from the reserve she kept against bad winters. The emergency fund that was supposed to be for feed costs and veterinary expenses and the kind of disasters that came without warning. She thought on the ride there that this qualified. Daniel Morrison was a small man with sharp eyes and the organized desk of someone who had made precision a personal commitment. He read both deeds in 7 minutes, asked 4 questions, and then looked up at her with an expression that was not sympathetic and not dismissive, but something rarer, simply professional. Which was what she'd needed. "The language is problematic," he said, "but not fatal. The 1874 Territorial Water Allocation Act gives original homesteaders a preferential claim that overrides later reclassification attempts. Provided, and this is critical, provided you can demonstrate continuous beneficial use. I've watered cattle from that creek every summer for 4 years, Clara said. I'll need documentation. I have 4 years of daily stock records, she said. I have the veterinary receipts that correspond to the summer stock counts, which prove the herd was alive, which proves they needed water, which proves I was using the creek. She paused. I also have letters from my father's records going back to 1871. Morrison looked at her steadily for a moment. Miss Whitmore, he said, you may have just made my job considerably easier. Good, she said. How long to file the documentation and establish the preferential claim? 2 weeks. To make it legally binding before Hackett's petition can proceed? He picked up his pen. 3 if I push. Push, she said. She rode home with the weight of the money spent sitness in her chest the way spent money always sat, not regretfully, but seriously, the way you carry a decision that was right and costly at the same time. She had the reserves to manage through the winter if the prices held. If they didn't hold, she would find another way, the same way she always found another way. What she would not do was lose that creek. She told William that evening, standing at his fence line as the sun went down, because he had asked her to and because she had decided she was done managing information about her own situation, as though sharing it was a vulnerability she couldn't afford. Morrison's filing in 2 weeks, she said. He's confident. Good, William said. You were right about him, she said. He's the right person. He's a good lawyer, William said. But he's going to win because you had the records. She thought about her father's ledgers, the meticulous daily entries in his handwriting, and then, after March of 1884, in her own, the record of every head of cattle, every expense, every outcome, kept with a consistency she had maintained, not because she'd anticipated needing it as legal evidence, but because her father had taught her that a person should know the exact state of what they were responsible for. He built everything into this land, she said, not to William specifically. Just out loud, the way you said things that needed to be said into the open air of a place that had earned the right to hear them. Every lesson, every tool, even the ones I didn't know I'd need. William was quiet beside her. He knew you were going to have to fight for it, he said. He knew I was going to have to fight for everything, she said. He just made sure I had what I needed to win. She looked at the creek. Visible from here, the line of it, the particular color of water in evening light. Her cattle moving along its bank in the slow, deliberate way. Cattle moved when they'd had enough to eat and were looking for a place to settle. I'm not going to lose this land, she said. Not as a wish. Not as a hope. As a statement of fact in the same register she used for weather observations and cattle counts. No, William said, you're not. She believed him. That was the part she hadn't expected, not just that he said it, but that she believed it when he did. She was still thinking about that when she rode home. What she was not expecting, when she got back to the farmhouse, was the wagon parked in her yard. She recognized it as she came through the gate, the Millhaven mercantile wagon. The brown one with the chipped wheel hub that Gerald Hackett had never gotten around to fixing because he could afford a new wagon and the brokenness of the old one didn't inconvenience him enough to address. The recognition landed in her stomach like something cold. The man sitting on her porch steps was not Gerald Hackett. He was younger, late 20s, city clothes, the kind of boots that had not seen significant outdoor use. He stood up when he saw her, which was the first thing he did that was worth noting. He had a leather satchel and the expression of someone who had been briefed on a situation and was now discovering that the briefing was incomplete. Miss Whitmore, he said, my name is Charles Aldous. I'm a surveyor working with the county land office. He paused. And with some local parties who have interest in the creek designation. She did not dismount. You work for Hackett, she said. He had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. I work for the county land office, he said. Some of my clients have overlapping interests with Mr. Hackett, yes. Mr. Aldous, Clara said, from the height of her horse. Looking down at him, You are sitting on the steps of my property without an invitation, representing interests that are actively attempting to damage mine. And you came here while I was away." She let that sit for a moment. "What would you like to tell me that you couldn't put in a letter?" He opened the satchel. He pulled out a document. "There's a proposal," he said, "from the parties involved. A buyout proposal that they believe is." "I have a lawyer," she said. "His name is Daniel Morrison of Morrison and Hatch in Sioux Falls. Any proposal goes to him." The name landed. She watched it land, the slight widening of the eyes. The recalibration. Morrison's reputation had made the trip ahead of her. "Miss Whitmore, good evening, Mr. Aldous," she said, and rode around him to the barn. She heard the wagon leave while she was unsaddling her horse. She did not go to the window to watch. She didn't need to see it to know what it meant that Hackett had sent an intermediary instead of coming himself, which meant he was less certain than he'd been pretending to be. Men who were certain showed up themselves. Men who were managing uncertainty sent other people first to see what they'd find. She had found her. She went inside and sat at her father's desk and wrote a letter to Daniel Morrison informing him of the visit and the attempted direct contact and asking him to note it in his documentation. She sealed the letter. She would send it in the morning. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling and let herself feel, for exactly 1 minute, the full weight of what she was carrying. The legal fight, the money she'd spent, the winter ahead. The 83 head that depended on her decisions being right. 1 minute. She timed it by the clock on the shelf. Then she picked up her pen and opened the ledger and began the evening's work. She did not write to William. She thought about it. She decided against it, not because she didn't want to, but because she was still learning the difference between not wanting to need someone and choosing. For tonight, to stand in her own kitchen and handle her own thoughts. The difference mattered. She was working on keeping it clear. She was working on a great many things. The next morning brought Hackett himself. She had been expecting it since Aldous drove away the previous evening, but knowing something is coming and being entirely prepared for it when it arrives are different animals. She heard the horses at the gate, and she went to the door, and he was already off his horse before she'd gotten it open. Moving toward the porch, with the purposeful manner of a man who had decided this conversation was going to go a particular way. He was not alone. Ed Brower was with him as always. And beside Brower was a man she had never seen older. Thick-set, dressed in the kind of clothes that said, "Money not from here." He carried himself the way men carried themselves when they were accustomed to rooms that rearranged themselves around their presence. "Miss Whitmore," Hackett said, coming up the porch, steps like they were his. "I think it's time we had a frank conversation." "You're welcome to have one," Clara said. From the doorway. She did not step back, she did not invite them in. "Stand there and have it." Hackett stopped. He had not quite expected that. He covered the hesitation quickly, the way he covered most things, with the particular ease of a man who had never had to develop actual confidence because the world had provided him with enough substitutes. "This is Mr. Franklin," he said, nodding to the man beside Brower. "He represents a land development company out of Chicago. They have an interest in acquiring property in this part of the territory." For what purpose?" Clara said. "Development," Franklin said. His voice was flat and professional. The kind of voice that had been trained to sound neutral while conveying that the neutrality was itself a kind of pressure. "The rail line is expanding. There will be a depot within 12 miles of this location within 3 years. Property values will shift significantly. We're offering current value purchase of select parcels to owners who can be gotten out before the values shift," Clara said. Franklin looked at her for a moment. "The offer is fair at current valuation," he said. "I don't need your assessment of the offer," she said. "I need you to tell me what you're actually proposing. So I can tell you what I'm actually going to do, and we can both stop pretending this is a courtesy call." Hackett stepped forward. "Clara, Miss Whitmore," she said. "We are not on a first-name basis." "Gerald." Something flickered behind his eyes. He steadied himself. "The water rights petition is going to proceed," he said. "The sympathetic manner entirely gone now. That creek will be reclassified. When it is, your operating cost for water access go up and your summer allocation goes down." "At 83 head, that's manageable," she said. "At current numbers," he said. "But you were planning to expand to 110. She had told no one that number except William Carter. The knowledge of that traveled through her body like cold water. She kept her face exactly where it was. She kept her voice exactly where it was. She said, "Where did you hear that?" Hackett smiled. "It's a small county, Miss Whitmore. People talk." She looked at him steadily. She looked at Brower, who was examining the porch railing. She looked at Franklin, who was watching her, with the flat professional attention of someone paid to read rooms. "You've been asking questions about my operation," she said. "My specific plans. We've been gathering information," Hackett said. "Due diligence. You've been gathering information about a private citizen's private business plans," she said. "You used that information to have a surveyor show up on my property without an invitation. And now you've brought a man from Chicago to tell me that the water rights I've had legal claim to for 4 years are suddenly negotiable." She looked at all three of them. "This is not a frank conversation. This is a campaign," Franklin said. "Miss Whitmore, I understand I have a lawyer," she said. "His name is Daniel Morrison. Everything goes to him." "This conversation is over. The offer won't stay on the table," Hackett said. "Good," she said. "I don't want it on the table." She went inside and closed the door. She stood in her kitchen and listened to them on the porch, the low voices, the sound of a decision being made, and then the boots on the steps and the horses being untied, and the sounds of them leaving. She stood very still until she was certain they were gone. Then she sat down at the table, because her legs had decided that standing was no longer the priority. She had kept her voice steady. She had kept her face steady. She was allowing herself, now that no one was watching, to shake a little, which was not weakness. She had stopped calling it weakness 2 years ago. Had made herself stop, because shaking after a hard thing was just the body's honest accounting of what it had cost. Her father had told her that. He'd been shaking himself when he told her, after a particularly brutal negotiation with a buyer who'd tried to short him on a cattle delivery. She had asked if he was all right. He had said he was fine. And that fine sometimes looked like this. She was fine. She was going to handle this. She was going to handle it because she had handled everything else. And because she had documentation and a good lawyer and 83 head of cattle that needed her to keep making the right decisions. She got up. She went to the desk. She wrote a second letter to Morrison, updating him on the morning's visit, noting the reference to her expansion plans, and the question of how Hackett had come by that information. She sealed it. Then she sat back and looked at the window and thought about who had known that number. William. And she, nobody else. She sat with that for a very long time. She was still sitting with it when she heard his horse in the yard. He knocked and she said, "Come in," without moving from the chair. And he came in and looked at her, and something in his face shifted immediately. He read people the way he read the land, with the attention of someone who knew what they were looking at. "What happened?" he said. "Hackett came this morning," she said. "With Brower and a man from Chicago, a development company." She looked at him directly. "He mentioned my expansion plan, the 110 head number." William went very still. "He mentioned that specifically," he said. "He mentioned it specifically." The stillness held. "Clara," he said. "Where did he get that number?" she said. Not accusing. The way she asked hard questions directly, without softening it down to something easier to answer. "I've told no one else. Not Dora Sims, not Morrison. Not anyone in town. You are the only person I've told." He crossed the room and sat down across from her at the table. And he looked at her with the same direct steadiness he brought to everything, and he said, "I didn't tell Hackett." "Then how does he know?" "I don't know," he said. but I need you to hear me when I say I didn't tell him." She looked at him. She looked at him the way she looked at everything she was trying to understand carefully. The whole of it, not just the part that was comfortable to examine. She looked at the 4 days of work, and the biscuits, and the Rome book, on the table, and the way he'd said "I've got you in the dark" on the roof, and the way he'd said "I should have told you about the water rights," without making her ask twice. She looked at all of it. "I believe you," she said. He held her gaze. He said. It came out quieter than she'd expected. "But someone talked," she said. "Someone who had access to information about my plans." "Aldous," William said. "The surveyor. He's been at the county land office." "If he had access to any of your filed documents, any permits." "Any applications I applied for a grazing permit extension last spring," Clara said. Slowly, the application included projected herd numbers. "Public record," William said. "County land office." She closed her eyes briefly. The cold, specific irritation of having been outmaneuvered on a technicality. "He didn't get it from you," she said. "He got it from my own paperwork, probably," William said. "And he let you think he had another source." She opened her eyes. "To see what I'd do," she said. To see if it would shake something loose," he said. "To see if you'd start questioning the people around you." The silence in the kitchen was a different quality now. "It nearly worked," she said. "Nearly," he agreed. She looked at him across the table and she said, "I'm sorry I don't," he said. "William, you asked a fair question," he said. "You had reason to ask it. Don't apologize for thinking clearly." He paused. "I'd rather you ask me directly than decide alone." She was quiet for a moment. "That's going to take some practice," she said. "I know," he said. "I've got time." And there it was, that thing she kept stepping up to and not quite knowing what to do with. Not a grand gesture. Not a simple, quiet, specific statement of intent from a man who's what he meant and meant what he said. She had spent 3 years alone, not because she had wanted to be alone. She had spent 3 years alone because she had not trusted that anyone who showed up would stay, that the help would come without a price attached, that the company would come without a cost, that the presence of another person would not eventually become another thing she had to manage on top of everything else. She was beginning, slowly and carefully, and with the full use of her good judgment, to revise that calculation. "Hackett's going to move faster now," she said. "He knows Morrison's involved. He knows I'm not going to fold. He'll push the water rights petition," William said. "Morrison has 2 weeks," she said. "I need to give him everything he needs before Hackett's people can file." She was already thinking through it. Already running the list, the records, the letters, the continuous use documentation, the survey notes her father had kept with the deed. "I'll pull the documentation tonight." "I'll do the same," William said. "My property borders the creek too. Morrison can file our claims jointly if the water rights language in both deeds is similar." She looked at him. "That doubles the documentation," she said. "It makes the preferential claim harder to challenge." "It does," he said. "This is your fight too," she said. "Not as an accusation and not as a discovery, as an acknowledgement." "It is," he said. "It's been my fight since the morning they rode up here with their sympathetic faces." He paused. "I don't like men who use concern as a weapon." She thought of his mother. The land outside Abilene. The man named Cole Whitfield who had shown up 6 days after the funeral. "Neither do I," she said. They worked until dark side by side at her father's desk, pulling documentation from the safe, organizing it into the order Morrison had specified. Clara writing the accompanying notes in her precise hand while William cross-referenced the dates against the deed records. It was not romantic. It was not soft. It was 2 people who were very good at their work, doing that work at the same table. And there was something in the particular plainness of it that felt more solid than romance, more lasting than softness. At 9 o'clock she set down her pen and looked at the stack of documentation they'd assembled and said, "That's enough to bury him." "Morrison will think so," William said. "Morrison won't need to think," she said. "Morrison will know." William looked at her across the desk. In the lamplight, with the papers between them and the documentation of 4 years of her life stacked in careful order. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for days now, like he'd decided something and was waiting for the right moment to say it. She decided she was done waiting for the right moment. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her steadily. "What?" "Whatever you've been not quite asking," she said. "Ask me." He was quiet for a moment. "When this is settled," he said. "When Morrison's filed and the claims established and Hackett's backed off and he will back off." He paused. "What do you want? Not for the land, not for the cattle. For you." She had not been asked that question in 4 years. Possibly longer. She held it for a moment, felt the unfamiliarity of it, the way a question could catch you off guard, not because it was hard, but because nobody had thought to ask it. "I want to expand the herd," she said. "I want to run this operation the way my father imagined it. I want to sit on this porch in 20 years and know that I built exactly what I intended to build." She looked at him. "And I want," she stopped, "Clara. I want to not do it alone," she said. "I have spent 3 years being very sure I didn't need anyone. And I have spent the last week finding out that needing and choosing are different things. And she pressed her lips together. "I want to choose. Whatever that looks like. I want to choose it instead of just surviving." He held her gaze for a long time. "That's a good answer," he said. "It's an honest one," she said. "Same thing," he said. And then, after a pause, "I'd like to be part of that choosing. If you're willing." The lamp burned between them. Outside, the Dakota Territory went about its enormous, indifferent business, the wind and the grass and the creek moving along her eastern fence line, carrying the water she had just spent 2 days fighting to keep. "I'm willing," she simple. "True." He nodded once. The way he nodded when something had been settled and didn't need more words spent on it. She appreciated that about him more than she had words to say. They finished the documentation. He left at 10 o'clock, taking his copies of the deed records and the survey notes that Morrison would need. She stood on the porch and watched his lantern move east through the dark, and she felt something in her chest that was not fear and not loneliness and not the cold arithmetic of insufficient resources. It took her a moment to name it, because she was out of practice. It was hope, the specific, grounded, working kind, not the kind that floated above the situation and asked you to believe in things you couldn't see, but the kind that stood in the same dirt as the problems and said, "This can be built. This is worth building. I know what I have and I know what it costs and I am willing to pay it." She had felt it before, when she'd made the first breeding decision after her father died. She had felt it the morning she'd counted 83 head instead of the 60 her father had left her. She had felt it, quietly, every time she'd opened the ledger and seen the numbers moving in the right direction. She felt it now, watching a man's lantern move through the dark toward his own property line, carrying documentation that was going to help her keep what was hers. She went inside. She opened the ledger. She wrote the date. She wrote the stock count. She wrote the expenses for the day, the cost of the lawyer, the cost of the documentation preparation, the calculation of what remained in the reserve. Then she wrote, at the bottom of the column, in the careful hand her father had recognized as her own, "Claim filed, ground holds." She closed the ledger. She went to bed. And somewhere to the east, along the creek that was hers by law and by labor and by the meticulous record of 4 years of days, the water moved the way. Water always moved toward the path that worked. Without sentiment, without stopping. It had been her father's water first. Now it was hers, and she intended to keep it. Morrison's letter arrived on a Thursday. Clara was in the barn when she heard the postal rider on the road, and she knew the way you know things when you have been waiting for them, with your whole body, that this was the one. She came out of the barn, still carrying the feed bucket, and she walked to the gate, and she took the letter from the rider's hand, and she stood right there in the yard and opened it. She read it twice. Then she set down the feed bucket, and she read it a third time. The county land office had accepted Morrison's filing. The preferential claim under the 1874 Territorial Water Allocation Act had been entered into the official record. Hackett's petition for reclassification had been reviewed and found to be in direct conflict with the established claim. The petition had been denied. The creek remained, legally and permanently, hers. Morrison had added a note at the bottom in his precise handwriting. The documentation you provided was exceptional. I have rarely seen a private citizen maintain records of this quality. Your father taught you well. Clara stood in her yard and read those last 4 words and felt something move through her that she had no immediate name for, something that started in her chest and went up, and she had to press her lips together hard and look up at the sky for a moment. Because she was not going to cry in her own yard over a letter. She had decided that, and she was a person who kept the decisions she made. She kept it together. She went inside and wrote to Morrison immediately a proper letter, thanking him, asking for his invoice, noting that she intended to pay the full balance within the month. Then she sat at the desk and she let herself feel it. The relief, and underneath the relief, something older and more fundamental. The sense that the ground was solid, that what she had built was still standing. She thought about her father's ledgers, the entries going back to 1871. The record of every head, every season, every fight. He had known she would need it. He had prepared her for a fight he knew was coming even when she hadn't. Thank you, she said, to the empty kitchen, to the desk he had built himself, to the man who had taught her that the measure of a person was what they refused to give up on. Then she picked up her hat and went to tell William. He was working the south fence when she came up, and he saw her face before she'd said a word she could tell by the way he stopped. The way his whole body went still with the attention of someone reading something important. It's done, he said. It's done, she said. Morrison filed. The petition was denied, the claims on record. He set down the fence tool. He crossed the 10 feet between them, and he took her hand, both of his, around hers. Just for a moment, just long enough to be real, and he said, "Good." That was all he said. It was enough. She had expected more. Perhaps a speech, a celebration, the kind of moment people made movies of. What she got instead was William Carter holding her hand for 10 seconds in a fence line in the middle of a working morning and saying "good," like it was the truest word in the English language. And she found to her surprise that this was exactly right. That this was precisely the shape of the thing she had wanted, without knowing she was wanting it. She rode home feeling lighter than she had in months. The lightness lasted 4 days. On the 5th day, she went into Millhaven for supplies and found out what Hackett had done next. She didn't find out from Dora Sims this time. She found out from the posted notice on the board outside the county surveyor's office, a formal document, stamped and dated, notifying all interested parties that a boundary survey had been commissioned for the eastern section of the Whitmore property, requested by adjacent landowner Gerald Hackett, citing concerns about the accuracy of the original 1871 homestead markers. She read it 3 times. She walked into the county surveyor's office, and she asked the clerk, a young man named Perkins, who had the expression of someone who had been anticipating this conversation and was not looking forward to it. She asked him when this had been filed. 2 days ago, ma'am, Perkins said. 2 days, she said. The water rights petition was denied 6 days ago, and he filed this 2 days ago. Perkins looked at the counter. That's correct, ma'am. Who authorized this survey? It's within his rights as an adjacent landowner to request a boundary verification, Perkins said. Carefully, the county is obligated to conduct it. On what grounds, she said. The original markers have been in place for 15 years. There have been no disputes. There have been no incidents. Mr. Hackett cited. Perkins looked at the paper in front of him. He cited inconsistencies in the recorded deed measurements and the physical markers, based on his own survey data. His own survey data, Clara said. Meaning the man he hired, meaning Aldous. Perkins said nothing. She looked at him steadily. When is the county survey scheduled? 3 weeks, he said. The surveyor will contact you directly to arrange access. She thanked him, which took effort, and she walked back out into the street, and she stood there for a moment with the specific cold clarity of a person who has just understood that the war they thought was over has simply moved to different ground. Hackett couldn't get the creek, so now he was coming for the land itself. The logic was clean and ugly. If he could establish that the original 1,871 homestead markers were inaccurately placed, he could argue that the recorded deed measurements were invalid, that the legal boundaries of her property were not where they had always been, that she had been perhaps grazing cattle on land that was not technically hers, that the eastern fence line, the one along the creek, was perhaps several yards in the wrong direction. Several yards might not sound like much. Several yards in the right direction would move the creek off her property entirely. She rode directly to Williams. He read the notice twice, and his jaw tightened in a way she hadn't seen before. A contained, controlled kind of anger, the kind that went quiet rather than loud, because it had decided to be useful instead of just felt. The original markers, he said. He's claiming they're off, she said. Aldous will testify to whatever Hackett needs him to testify to. Do you have the original survey documentation? William said. The 1,871 markers? In the safe, she said. My father kept everything. Physical markers, he said. The actual posts. Do you know where they are? She thought about it. My father walked me through them when I was 14, she said. East corner was a cedar post with a blaze cut into it. North boundary was 2 posts with a wire strung between them. The wire's long gone, but the post should still be there. South corner, she stopped. South corner was a stone cairn. My father built it himself from the creek bed. William looked at her. Show me, he said. They spent the rest of that afternoon walking her property boundaries. It was not a small task. The Whitmore land ran to 420 acres. And the perimeter took time even on horseback. But they found each marker. The cedar post on the east corner weathered but intact. The blaze cut unmistakable. The 2 posts on the north boundary. Still in the ground, the old wire rusted to nothing but the post set deep and solid. The stone cairn on the south corner, built by her father's hands from creek stones in 1,871. Standing exactly where he'd placed it. And they found something else. On the southeast corner, the corner closest to Hackett's scrubland. The corner most relevant to any argument about where the creek boundary fell, there was a marker that should have been a cedar post like the others. Was a cedar post, or had been. The post was there. But Blidge's cut was fresh. Clara crouched down and looked at it and felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. The original blaze cut, the one her father would have made in 1,871, should have been deep inside the wood by now. Grown over, visible only when the bark was removed. What she was looking at was a fresh cut, a recent cut. A cut that had been made in the last several months and positioned 6 inches east of where the original cut would have been. 6 inches east moved the boundary 6 inches east. 6 inches east at this corner shifted the creek to just outside her legal claim. Someone had altered the marker. She looked at William. He was crouching beside her, and he was looking at the cut, and his jaw was doing that quiet anger thing again, and he said, very carefully, when did you last walk this corner? Spring, she said. April. I was checking the fence line. Was the cut there in April? No, she said. I would have noticed. I know this would. She looked at the post. This was done after April. After the water rights fight started, she stood up. He had someone come on my property and alter my boundary marker. He's going to claim the altered marker is the correct one, William said. And that your records and your deed measurements support the new position, not the old one. He needs Aldous to say the measurements match the altered marker, she said. Aldous will say whatever he's paid to say. Then I need something he can't say away. She looked at the post. I need a witness to the original. Someone who saw this marker before it was altered. She thought fast. Running through names, running through history. Perkins in the county office. He was a boy when my father surveyed this land. But he was here. His family too close to the county machinery, William said. Hackett's got influence there. Then who? She stopped. Old Tom Reeves, she said. William looked at her. He was the original county surveyor in 1871, she said. He's the one who walked this land with my father. He's retired. He lives out on the Vermilion Road. She looked at William. He's 72 years old and he remembers everything. Is he willing to testify? William said. I have no idea, she said. I've never asked him for anything. She paused. I'm going to ask him tomorrow. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the dark and listened to the ordinary sounds of the house and the land, and she ran through the situation with the same systematic accounting. She brought to her ledgers what she had, what she needed, what the gap between them would cost. What she had: 4 years of records, the original deed, the physical markers, including the one that had been tampered with. Photographs? No, she did not have photographs, but she had something close. Her father had made detailed sketches of the boundary markers in 1871, drawn to scale, kept in the same folder as the deed. She had seen them many times and never thought of them as evidence. They were evidence. What she needed: testimony that confirmed the original marker position. Morrison's involvement again. Time, what the gap would cost. Another lawyer's fee. Another drawn-out fight. More of the reserve she'd been trying to rebuild since the first round. She lay with that. Then she got up and went to the desk and wrote to Morrison. Because lying in the dark going over a problem she'd already analyzed fully was not a use of time she could afford. Tom Reeves lived in a small house on the Vermilion Road, with a kitchen garden and a dog of advanced years, and the collected survey maps of 43 years of county work stacked in every room. He opened the door when Clara knocked and looked at her with the bright-eyed sharpness of a man whose body had slowed down but whose mind had not, and said, "You're Eli Whitmore's girl." "Yes, sir," she said. "Come in," he said. "I've been wondering when someone would come." She looked at him. "Sit down," he said, and she sat down. And he went to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and came back and sat across from her with the direct manner of a man who had spent his life dealing in exact measurements and had no patience for the inexact kind. "Gerald Hackett came to see me last week," he said. Clara set down her cup. "He came to see you," she said. "He did." Reeves wrapped his hands around his own cup. "He told me there was going to be a boundary survey. He told me the original markers on the Whitmore property were inaccurately placed. He suggested very politely that my records from 1871 might reflect certain errors that I had made at the time. Due to his words, the difficulty of the conditions. He was asking you to say your own survey was wrong," Clara said. "He was offering me money to say my own survey was wrong," Reeves said. $1,100. He made it sound like a correction of the record. He made it sound like I'd be doing the county a service. $1,100. Clara looked at the old man across the table. She looked at his house, which was clean and small, and showed the evidence of a man living carefully within a fixed income. She looked at the dog sleeping near the stove. She looked at the survey maps stacked against every wall. "What did you tell him?" she said, very quiet. Tom Reeves looked at her with Eli Whitmore's daughter's eyes, and he said, "I told him that a man who will falsify his own professional record for money doesn't have a professional record worth falsifying, and that he could take his $1,100 and go directly to hell." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Mr. Reeves, would you be willing to testify to the accuracy of the original 1871 survey?" "I've been waiting for you to ask," he said. She could have cried. She kept it together because she had decided she was going to. And she looked at the old man and she said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "Your father was a fair man who paid a fair price for a fair survey, and I am not going to let what I built with him be used against what he built for you." He picked up his cup. "Now tell me exactly what Hackett's people have done to that southeast marker, and I'll tell you whether it matches what I know those measurements should be." She told him everything. He listened with his coffee cup and his bright eyes and his 43 years of county survey knowledge, and when she was done, he went to the stack of maps against the east wall, and he pulled out a roll of paper, and he spread it on the table, and he showed her in precise lines and numbers, and the handwriting of a younger Tom Reeves in 1871, exactly where every marker on the Whitmore property had been placed. The southeast marker was 6 inches west of where Hackett's man had moved it. 6 inches, exactly 6. He had someone do this carefully, Reeves said. This wasn't a guess. Someone who knew what they were looking at made this change. Aldous, Clara said. He's a surveyor, Reeves said. He'd know how to do it in a way that could be argued as the original. He looked at Clara. But not to me. She rode home with Tom Reeves's testimony in her pocket, not literally, but near enough. She had the copy of his original survey that he'd pressed on her. The one with his signature and the county seal from 1871. She had his commitment to appear before Morrison. She had, for the first time since Hackett had started this second campaign, the specific sensation of being ahead of a problem instead of behind it. She was almost to the gate when she saw the wagon in her yard. Not Hackett's wagon, it was a woman's wagon, a single horse. A modest rig, the kind a farm wife drove into town and back. Clara didn't recognize it immediately, and then she recognized the horse, and her chest did something complicated and quick. It was Margaret Aldis's horse, the surveyor's wife. Clara came through the gate, and Margaret Aldis was standing on the porch, a thin woman, mid-30s, with the permanent worry line between her brows that came from living alongside a man whose decisions were not always reliable. She had her hands clasped in front of her, and she looked at Clara with an expression that was not comfortable and not apologetic, and not quite either of those things, but somewhere more complicated. "Mrs. Aldis, Miss Whitmore," she swallowed. "I need to tell you something. My husband," she stopped. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I am telling it to you, because what's happening isn't right. And I know it isn't right, and I have been sitting with that knowledge for 2 weeks, and I cannot sit with it any longer." Clara got off her horse. She tied her off at the post. She said, "Come inside." They sat at the kitchen table, and Margaret Aldis told her everything. Charles Aldis had been hired by Hackett and Brower not after the water rights fight, but before it. 6 months before, he had been hired to do a quiet assessment of the Whitmore property, not an official one. Nothing on record, just a private evaluation of the land's vulnerabilities. He had identified the water rights language as the primary weakness. He had identified the boundary markers as a secondary option, to be used if the water rights approach failed. He had been paid to make both strategies viable. The southeast marker had been altered in July. Aldis had done it himself, at night, alone. His wife had found out 2 weeks ago when she'd discovered the payment record in his accounts, a second payment from Hackett, much larger than the first. "He told me it was legitimate survey work," Margaret Aldis said. "He told me Hackett had hired him to verify measurements." She looked at her hands. "But the amount, and then I found the first payment from 6 months ago, and I started adding things up," and she pressed her lips together. "He falsified a county marker. That's a criminal act. And he did it to take away your land." Clara sat very still. "Mrs. Aldis," she said carefully, "is your husband aware that you're here?" "No," she said. "He's in Sioux Falls. He won't be back until Saturday. And you're willing to state what you've told me?" "In writing, in front of a lawyer." Margaret Aldis looked at her. In her eyes was the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been carrying the weight of a man's bad decisions for long enough that the decision to set it down felt like the only breath she'd taken in weeks. "Yes," she said, "I am." Clara wrote to Morrison that same evening, a third letter in as many weeks. The longest one yet. She laid out everything, the altered marker, Tom Reeves's survey documentation, Margaret Aldis's testimony, the timeline of payments that established conspiracy rather than negligence. She wrote it in her precise hand without embellishment. Just the facts in the order they happened, because facts in order were what Morrison needed, and what Hat's people could not rewrite. She sealed the letter. She sat back. She thought about Gerald Hackett, who had spent 6 months engineering this, who had hired a man and corrupted a county marker and tried to buy an old surveyor's silence and sent an intermediary to her porch and brought a man from Chicago to her yard and used concern as a weapon and patience as a strategy, and who had, in the end, underestimated her in the specific way that men who did not look carefully at women always underestimated the ones they had decided weren't worth looking at. He had not counted on Margaret Aldous. He had not counted on Tom Reeves. He had not counted on 4 years of ledgers and a hidden floor safe and a woman who had been taught by her father that you kept everything because you never knew what you'd need. He had most especially not counted on William Carter. She went to the window and looked east toward the Carter property line, and she thought about what William had said that evening at the table. "I'd like to be part of that choosing." She thought about what she'd said back. "I'm willing." She thought about how those two things had sat in the air between them with the solidity of something that had been decided. She put on her coat. She crossed the half-mile to his property in the dark with a lantern in her hand, which was something she had not done before gone to him. At night without a practical reason. This was not a practical visit. This was a different kind. He opened the door before she knocked. He'd seen the lantern coming, and he looked at her face and said, "What happened?" "Good things," she said. "A great many good things." All at once. She stepped inside. "And I wanted to tell you in person because you are the person I want to tell things to." He looked at her steadily. She told him about Tom Reeves and about Margaret Aldous and about the letter to Morrison. All of it in the same efficient order she'd laid it out in writing. Because she was someone who believed in saying things clearly, whether she was writing them or speaking them. He listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions at precisely the right moments. When she finished, he was quiet for a beat, and then he said, "It's over. Morrison needs to act on it," she said. "He will," William said. "Hackett doesn't have a move left." "The marker tampering alone is a criminal matter," she said. "Yes," she paused. "Morrison may refer it to the county sheriff." "I want him to." William looked at her. "You want Hackett charged," he said. "I want Charles Aldous charged," she said. "Hackett paid him. Let the charges follow the money and end up wherever they end up." She looked at him. "I don't want revenge. I want the record to reflect what actually happened to my land, so it never happens again." "It won't happen again," he said. "I know," she said. "Because it's going to be on record." He was quiet for a moment. "Then your father would be proud." She pressed her lips together. Held it. Let it land in the solid place where the real things landed. "Sit down," he said. "I'll make coffee." She sat at his table, the one with the Rome book still marking the same place. Or a different place now, she couldn't tell, and she watched him move around his kitchen with the familiar ease of a man in his own space, and she felt the particular warmth of a room that had become, in the space of 2 weeks, somewhere she recognized. "I want to ask you something," she said. He set the coffee on. Turned around, asked. "The expansion," she said. 110 head. "I've been planning it alone, working out how to finance it. What the breeding program looks like, the timeline." She paused. "I want your opinion." He looked at her for a moment. Not surprised exactly. More like a man who has been patient about something for long enough that when it arrives he knows to receive it quietly, so as not to startle it away. "Tell me what you've planned," he said. She told him. The full plan, the financing she'd arranged through a contact in Sioux Falls. Not Brower's Bank, a private loan at a rate she'd negotiated herself. The breeding strategy, the Hereford crosses she'd been tracking since spring. The timeline, spring expansion, summer assessment. Winter planning, the market projections she'd been building from the Sioux Falls Telegraph reports. She laid it out with the same specificity she used with Morrison. Because she had decided that the people who deserved her trust deserved the full truth of what she was thinking. When she was done, William picked up his coffee. He said, "Your financing rate is good. I know it is," she said. "I spent 3 weeks negotiating it. The breeding strategy is sound. The Hereford crosses will throw well in this climate." "I know that too," she said. "I watched yours." He smiled, a real one fuller than the almost smiles she'd been cataloging. It changed his face in a way she was going to need more time to get used to. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Access to your bull," she said. The Shorthorn cross. He'd improved the cold tolerance in the second generation. She looked at him directly. "I'll pay the stud fee at market rate." "I'm not asking for a favor. I know you're not," he said. "I'm asking for a business arrangement," she said. "Between two neighboring operations with aligned interests." He looked at her for a long moment. "Aligned interests," he said. "Among other things," she said. He was quiet. She waited. She was good at waiting when she knew what she was waiting for. "I don't want a stud fee," he said. "William, I want a partnership," he said. "Not a sentimental one. A legal one, a business one. A formal arrangement that reflects what's actually true, that these two operations share a boundary line and a water source, and a set of interests that would benefit from being managed together." He paused. "A partnership, with appropriate documentation. Reviewed by Morrison." She looked at him. "You want to go into business with me," she said. "I want to go into everything with you," he said. Very quietly. "The business is just the part I know how to put on paper." The kitchen was warm. The coffee was ready. Outside, the Dakota Territory was doing its nighttime work, vast and constant and entirely indifferent to the two people sitting at a table deciding what to build. She looked at him across the table, and she thought about the word her father had used. The one he'd said to her the morning she'd told him she was going to stay and run the ranch herself after he got sick. The morning she'd told him she didn't need anyone else to do it. He had looked at her with those clear eyes and said one word. Good. Not because she didn't need anyone, but because she knew what she was choosing. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "I want it in writing," she said. "Full documentation." "Agreed," he said. "Equal shares on the joint decisions," she said. "Agreed," he said. "And I reserve the right to tell you when I think you're wrong," she said. "I'd be concerned if you didn't," he said. She picked up her coffee cup. He picked up his. They sat in the warm kitchen in the honest company of two people who had looked at each other carefully and decided, on the basis of the evidence, that this was worth building. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a speech. It was 2 cups of coffee and a kitchen table, and the specific, solid, working kind of decision that doesn't require music to make it true. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, Clara Whitmore thought. Looking at the man across the table, who had shown up with biscuits in the dark, and held her rope in a storm, and looked at her face first every single time. Exactly what she had been building toward, without knowing she was building toward anything. Her father had given her the land. He had given her the grit and the ledgers and the hidden floor safe, and the knowledge of how to sister, and the understanding that the measure of a person was what they refused to give up on. He had given her everything, and she had used it all. She was still using it. She was going to use every last bit of it for the rest of her life, which was going to be a long one, on land that was hers, with cattle that were thriving, and a man across a kitchen table who had decided she was worth showing up for. She finished her coffee. She said, "I should get back. Early morning tomorrow. I'll walk you to the gate," he said. "You don't have to, Clara," he said. She stopped. He looked at her. "I know I don't have to," he said. "That's not why I'm doing it." She understood the distinction. She understood it in her bones. They walked to the gate in the dark, the lantern between them, and he waited while she untied her horse. And he said, "Good night, Clara." And she said, "Good night." William and she rode home under a sky that was enormous and full of stars and entirely, unhurriedly her own. She put her horse up. She went inside. She opened the ledger. She wrote the date. She wrote the stock count. She wrote the expenses. She wrote the note about Morrison's letter and the plan to contact him again in the morning. Then at the bottom of the page, in the column where she had written "not alone" 9 days ago, she wrote 3 words that she had never written in this ledger before. 3 words that were not a cattle count and not an expense and not a record of anything that had happened today except the truest thing. Choosing, not surviving. She closed the ledger. She looked at the safe in the floor beneath the table, her father's safe. Built into the foundation of the house he'd built for her. The one that held 4 years of evidence that she was exactly who she had always been. She said, quietly, to the kitchen, to the house, to the man who had taught her that what she built was the measure of her. "I've got it from here." Then she went to bed, and the land held. Morrison moved fast, faster than Clara had expected, which told her that he had been waiting for exactly this kind of evidence, the kind that didn't just argue a position but proved a sequence. Aldis's payment records, Margaret's testimony, Tom Reeves's original survey documentation. The altered marker itself, which Morrison had arranged for the county sheriff to photograph and catalog before anyone else could touch it. All of it landed in the county office like a stone through glass. And the sound it made carried all the way to Gerald Hackett's front door. Charles Aldis was arrested on a Friday morning. Clara heard about it the way she heard about most things, through the particular telegraph of a small county that could not keep a secret for longer than 24 hours. Dora Sims told her, this time with the breathless specificity of someone who had always suspected the ending would be dramatic. Aldis had been taken into custody on charges of fraudulent alteration of a county survey marker, which carried real weight under territorial law. Brower had been called to the county office for questioning and had, by all accounts, emerged looking considerably diminished. Hackett himself had not yet been charged, but Morrison had made clear in his filing that the evidence of conspiracy was substantial and that further action was being considered. Clara listened to all of this, and she said thank you. Dora, and she bought her supplies and she loaded the wagon, and she drove home, and she did not allow herself to feel victorious. Because victory was not the right word for it. What had happened was not a victory. What had happened was a reckoning, a correction, the re-establishment of a fact that had always been true, but that someone had spent 6 months trying to make false. She had not won something that wasn't hers. She had kept something that already was. That was different. Her father had taught her the difference. She got home and fed the cattle and checked the creek, and stood at the eastern fence line, the real eastern fence line, with the southeast corner post standing where Tom Reeves had placed it in 1871, and she looked at her land in the afternoon light and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not just since Hackett had started his campaign, since before that. Since the morning she'd stood at her father's grave in the frozen ground, and understood that from that day forward, every decision was hers, and every consequence was hers, and every fight was hers to fight alone. And that the weight of that was simply the weight of her life now. To be carried without complaint, because complaining would not lighten it, and she did not have the luxury of setting it down. She had been carrying it that way for 3 years. She was setting it down now, not because she was done. Not because it had gotten lighter, but because she had learned slowly, in the way you learn things that require your whole life to understand, that carrying something alone and carrying something well were not the same requirement, and that she had been confusing them for years. William rode up to the fence line about 20 minutes after she got there, which meant he'd seen her wagon come through the gate and had given her time to settle before following. She had noticed he did things like that, read the shape of what a person needed, and then delivered exactly that without being asked. "You heard," he said. "Dora Sims," she said. He came through the gate and stood beside her. And they looked at the eastern fence line together, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Which was exactly right. "Morrison wants to meet next week," she said. "The partnership paperwork is ready." "I know," he said. "He wrote to me too." She looked at him sideways. "He wrote to you directly. He said it would save time," William said. and the corner of his mouth did the thing. "I think he's figured out that we generally arrive at the same conclusions." "We don't always agree," she said. "No," he said. "But we always get to the same place eventually." She thought about that. It was true. They had disagreed about the financing timeline. For the expansion, he'd thought she could move faster. She'd thought his optimism was outrunning the numbers. And they'd spent an entire evening at her kitchen table going through it line by line before she'd admitted he was right about 2 of the 3 points, and he'd admitted she was right about the third. The conversation had cost them 3 hours and produced something she recognized as better than what either of them would have arrived at alone. She was getting used to that. She was, with deliberate effort, letting herself get used to it. "The town's going to have opinions," she said. "About the partnership. About the 2 of us working the land jointly. The town's had opinions about you since before you can remember," William said. "Has that slowed you down before?" "No," she said. "Then why would it now?" She was quiet for a moment. "It's different," she said. "Before they thought I was stubborn and hopeless, and too big for the frontier, and too independent for my own good. Now they're going to think," she stopped. "They're going to think I found a man to save me." The words came out with a particular edge. Because they had been sitting in her since the news about Aldous broke, and she'd stood in Dora Sims's shop and seen the look on Dora's face, not malicious, just assuming the look of a woman who had already rewritten the story in her head. The poor Whitmore girl finally found someone to take care of things. William turned to look at her directly. "Clara," he said. "I know it's not true," she said. "I know what I built, and I know who built it. I know what the ledgers say, and I know what Morrison's filing says, and I know what Tom Reeves's survey says." She looked at the fence line. I need you to know that whatever the town decides this story is, I know what it actually is." "I know you do," he said. "And I need you to know," she said, and the words were harder now, coming from a place she didn't open easily, "that I am not building a partnership with you because I need rescuing. I'm building it because it is the right decision for this operation, and because you are a man I trust, and because." She stopped. "Because," she looked at him. "Because I want to," she said. "Because it's a choice I'm making, not a circumstance I'm accepting. Because choosing this is the bravest thing I've done in 3 years, and I need you to understand that. Not so you'll be impressed, but so you'll know what it cost me and what it means." He held her gaze for a long time. Long enough that she felt it all the way down. "I know exactly what it cost you," he said. "And I know exactly what it means." He paused. "And for what it is worth, which I hope is something you have not been saved by anyone. You saved yourself. Everything you needed to keep this land. You had before I walked through your door." She held that. "You helped," she said. "I handed you tools," he said. "You knew how to use them before I arrived." She looked away. The creek, the cattle moving along its bank, the land that had held through everything. "My father would have said something like that," she said. "He sounds like a man who knew how to tell the truth about people," William said. "He was," she said. "He was the first and who ever did." She said it and felt the full weight of it, what it meant that the first person to see her clearly had been the one she'd lost, and what it meant that she had spent 3 years since then doing everything in her power to make sure she never needed anyone to see her again. As though if she could make herself need nothing, she could never again lose the thing she needed most. William stood beside her and said nothing, which was what the moment required. She was grateful for it. "Come to supper tonight," she said. "I'm making the pot roast." "Is that an order or an invitation?" he said. "Does it matter?" she said. "Not particularly," he said. They both knew what it was. The following week, Clara and William rode to Sioux Falls together and sat in Daniel Morrison's office and signed the partnership agreement that Morrison had prepared, a formal, legal document that established joint operational rights over specific shared resources, including the bull stud arrangement, the water allocation, and the east boundary fence maintenance, with clearly defined individual ownership boundaries for each party's land and cattle separately. Morrison had drawn it up with the meticulous care he brought to everything. And he reviewed it section by section, and Clara asked 12 questions and William asked 4. And 3 of her questions and 2 of his produced amendments that Morrison agreed were improvements. When it was signed and witnessed, Morrison set down his pen and looked at both of them and said, "In 20 years of practice, I have never had clients who came to a partnership agreement already knowing exactly what they wanted and exactly what they were willing to offer." He paused. "It made my job considerably easier." "Good," Clara said. "I intend to keep making your job easier." "I expect you will," Morrison said, with something that was almost warmth. They rode back to Millhaven in the late afternoon, and the conversation on the ride was the kind of conversation she had been starving for her whole life. Without knowing it, 2 people who were both good at what they did, talking about what they did, with the ease of people who trusted each other's minds. She talked about the spring breeding plan, and he talked about his idea for a shared hay supply arrangement that would reduce individual storage costs, and they argued cheerfully about the optimal timing of the first cull of the season, and she told him he was wrong, and explained why, and he told her she had a point, and where he thought her reasoning had a gap, and she thought about it for a mile, and told him the gap was real but smaller than he thought. It was, she thought, the best conversation she'd had on horseback in years. Possibly ever. When they came into Millhaven, people looked. Clara had expected that. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for most things she couldn't change by deciding in advance how she was going to carry herself when it happened. She was going to ride straight, and she was going to look at the people who looked at her, and she was going to let them see what they saw, which was a woman on a horse who had just signed a legal partnership agreement with a neighboring rancher after defeating an attempt to steal her water rights and falsify her property boundaries. She let them look. She looked back. Ed Brower was coming out of his bank when they passed. And he stopped on the steps and looked at her, and she looked at him with the same steady regard she had looked at him with across every table and every yard and every difficult conversation. And he looked away first. He had been doing that lately. She noticed it the way she noticed most things, quietly, without making a production of it. Gerald Hackett she did not see. Hackett had, by several accounts, become considerably less visible in Millhaven in the 3 weeks since Morrison's filing. There was talk that the Chicago developer Franklin had withdrawn his interest in the county, which made sense. A man who made money from land acquisition did not want to be associated with a land acquisition campaign that had resulted in criminal charges. There was further talk that Hackett was consulting his own lawyer, which also made sense. Clara had not spoken to Hackett since the morning she'd closed her door on him. She did not expect to need to. What she had not expected was what happened at the general store. She came in for supplies, the usual list: flour and salt and lamp oil, and the coffee that William had developed an opinion about, after she'd refused to buy the cheaper grade, and she was at the counter when she heard the voice behind her. "Miss Whitmore." She turned. It was Nell Prater, who ran the boarding house on the east end of town, and whose husband had been one of the men laughing in the saloon the day Clara had come to buy lumber 3 years ago. Nell was a broad woman in her 50s with a direct manner and the particular air of someone who had made a decision and was carrying it through. "Mrs. Prater," Clara said. "I owe you an apology," Nell Prater said. Clara looked at her. "My husband said some things years back about whether you could manage that ranch." She held Clara's gaze with the determination of someone who had rehearsed this and was getting through it regardless. "He was wrong. And I knew he was wrong when he said it, and I didn't say so. And that was also wrong. The store had gone quiet in the particular way of small-town spaces when something real was happening." Clara held Nell Prater's gaze. "Why are you telling me now?" she said. Not unkindly, genuinely asking. "Because what Hackett tried to do to you was wrong," Nell said. "And because you're the one who stopped it, and because I have been watching you hold this town's opinions of you for 3 years, and do something with them, other than let them stop you. And I think that deserves to be acknowledged." She paused. "By somebody." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Prater," she said. I appreciate it. She meant it. It was not a grand thing, and it was not a complete thing. An apology from one woman did not rewrite 3 years of a town's assumptions, but it was a true thing, offered without calculation, and she had learned to value true things in whatever size they came. She finished her shopping. She loaded the wagon. She drove home. She was halfway there when she started laughing, not at anything specific. At all of it, maybe the sum of it, the 3 years of fighting and the patent ridiculousness of a man like Hackett thinking he could outmaneuver a woman who kept 4 years of daily cattle records in a hidden floor safe. The sheer amount of effort everyone had put into time deciding what she was worth before they'd looked at what she'd actually built. The fact that she had stood on her porch in a storm and nearly choked on the word help before going to a neighbor's door, and now had a legal business partner and the best breeding program in the county, and an almost smile that she was learning to read like weather. She laughed until her eyes watered, and the horse looked back at her with mild concern, and she wiped her face and said, "We're fine," to the horse, who appeared to accept this. She was fine. She was more than fine. She was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where she had decided to be. The spring came the way spring came in Dakota Territory, not gently, not gradually, but in a sudden decisive rush that said, "Here it is," and meant it. The ground thawed. The creek ran high and clear and entirely legally hers. The cattle came through the winter at 81 head. 2 losses to cold that she had documented and analyzed and adjusted her management for. And the first of the new calves arrived in March with the square, sturdy frames of the Hereford crosses and the cold-weather constitution of the Shorthorn blood, exactly as she'd calculated. She stood in the barn on the morning the first calf was born, and she looked at it still wet, already trying to stand, that particular determination that newborn cattle had, that she had always found disproportionately moving, and she thought about her father saying, "The measure of a person was what they built." She had built this. She had built 81 head from 60. And she was going to build 110 from 81. And she was going to do it with a man she trusted, and a lawyer she respected, and a survey record that was now on file at the county office and available for anyone who wanted to look. William arrived at 8 in the morning, the way he had been arriving every working morning since the partnership agreement was signed, not every moment, not underfoot, not managing her operation, but present, engaged, bringing the specific competence she had recognized in him the first night and had continued to recognize every day since. He came through the barn door and looked at the calf, and looked at Clara and said, First one, she confirmed. He crouched down and looked at the calf with the assessing eye of a man who understood what he was looking at. Strong, she said. She stood in under an hour. He looked up at her. She? Had Clara said. Good news for the herd, he smiled. The full one she had never gotten used to and did not intend to. Good start, he said. It's a good year, she said. She meant more than the calf, and they both knew it. The town's opinion of Clara Whitmore shifted that spring in the incremental, grudging way that towns shifted opinions, not all at once. Not dramatically, but in the accumulation of small moments that added up to something different from what had been there before. It started with the water rights case, which had been public enough that everyone knew the facts, and continued with the Aldous arrest, which had clarified for even the most generous interpreters of Hackett's motives that what had happened to the Whitmore property was not the concerned intervention of civic-minded neighbors, but a coordinated campaign to take land from a woman they'd assumed wouldn't be able to defend it. The assumption had been wrong. That part was also public. Dora Sims started treating her like a businesswoman rather than a subject of concern. The clerk at the county office began holding the weekly telegraph reports for her when they came in, without her having to ask. Tom Reeves came to call twice in the spring, not for any particular reason. Just visiting, the way old men visited people they decided they liked. And Clara made coffee, and they talked about the survey maps and about her father, and she found, to her surprise, that she had a great deal to say about her father to a man who had known him in the early years, had known him when he was 23 with $40 and a bad horse. He was terrified, Reeves said, the second visit. With the directness of old age. When he came out here, he didn't look it. He had that same expression you have, like the thing in front of him was simply a problem to be solved. And he had the tools. He paused. But I walked that property with him for 3 days and I knew. He looked at her. He was terrified and he did it anyway. Yes, Clara said. He did. Same as you, Reeves said. She looked at him. I was terrified, she said. When he died, when Hackett came the first time. When the roof came in during the storm. She paused. When I walked to William Carter's door in the rain and couldn't get the words out. Were you terrified when you signed the partnership agreement? Reeves said. She thought about it. No, she said, that one felt like arriving. He nodded slowly. That's what it's supposed to feel like, he said. She thought about that for a long time after he left. The summer brought the kind of work she loved hard. Specific, real, the kind that left you tired in the bones and satisfied in a way that nothing else quite replicated. She and William worked the expansion together through June and July, moving deliberately through the breeding program, tracking each outcome, adjusting where the adjustments were needed. They disagreed about 3 things and resolved all 3 through the same process. Evidence first, argument second, decision together. She was wrong once and said so. He was wrong once and said so. The record showed both, which she found unexpectedly satisfying. By August, they were at 96 head and on track. It was in August that the thing happened that Clara had not predicted, which was remarkable given that she had predicted most things. She was at the creek with the cattle, the long August task of making sure the summer water held, monitoring the levels, moving the herd across the bank in sections to avoid overgrazing when she heard a horse coming fast up the east road. Fast enough that she turned to look, which was not her habit, because horses on the east road were not unusual and fast ones were just impatient riders. It was Margaret Aldous. Clara had seen her 3 times since the winter, once at Morrison's office to give her formal testimony, once briefly at the dry goods store, once at the church. Each time Margaret Aldous had the look of a woman in the middle of a process she had not finished yet not settled. Not broken, somewhere actively in between. She pulled her horse up at the fence line, and she looked at Clara, and Clara could see immediately that something had happened. What is it? Hackett, Margaret said. And her voice had a quality Clara hadn't heard in it before, not fear. Something closer to urgency, the sound of a person carrying news they don't entirely know what to do with. He's withdrawing, looked at her. Withdrawing from what? She said. Everything, Margaret said. He's selling. The mercantile. The scrubland, the whole interest in the county. He's going back east. My husband Charles, as she stopped, pressed her lips together. Charles is going to testify against him. The county sheriff asked him, and he agreed. And Hackett found out this morning, and she took a breath. He's going. He told Brower this morning. Brower told half the town by noon. Clara stood at her fence line with the August sun on the creek behind her, and she felt the newsland in layers, the immediate, practical meaning of it first, which was that the primary organized threat to her land was dismantling itself. And then the deeper meaning, which was something she hadn't quite let herself expect, and which was therefore arriving with a force she hadn't braced for. It was over. Not just the water rights, not just the boundary survey. All of it. The 6-month campaign, the 3 years of accumulating pressure, the sympathetic expressions in the prepared documents, and the men on horses who came at her with concern as a weapon, all of it was packing up and going back east. And what remained was the land in the creek and 81 cattle, now heading toward 110, and a partnership on Morrison's office, and a man who showed up every morning because he'd decided she was worth showing up for. Are you all right? Margaret Aldous said. Clara realized she'd been silent for longer than she'd intended. Yes, she said. Thank you for coming to tell me. You should have been the first to know, Margaret said. After everything, you should have been the first. Clara looked at her. Margaret Aldous had upended her own life to do the right thing. Had walked into a situation where the right thing cost her considerably. And had done it anyway. "How are you managing?" Clara said. Not the polite version. The real version. Margaret looked at her and seemed to understand the difference. "Day by day," she said. "Charles, it's hard, but it's better than knowing and not saying." She paused. Most days I think that. It is," Clara said. "I promise you it is." She gathered her reins. Then she stopped. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "for what it's worth, I've been watching what you've built out here. What you've held on to." She paused. "It's something worth holding." She rode away. Clara stood at the fence line until the horse was gone from sight. Then she looked at her cattle, on the bank of her creek, on her land, in the August light that her father had called the honest hour. She felt the full weight of 3 years. Not the burden of it, just the weight. The solid factual mass of it, the way any real thing has weight when you pick it up and hold it in both hands and look at it clearly. 3 years of not asking. 3 years of carrying everything as proof. 3 years of "I don't need, and I can manage, and I'll handle it." Said into empty kitchens and early mornings, and every moment when she'd wanted to put the weight down, and couldn't, because putting it down had seemed like the same thing as giving in. It was not the same thing. She knew that now. She had known it. She thought, since the morning William had brought biscuit in the dark and set them on her table without making a ceremony of it. She had been working her way toward knowing it every day since. She went to find him. He was at the north fence, the way he often was in the afternoon. Working with the focused, unhurried attention he brought to everything. He heard her coming and turned and looked at her, and she could see him reading her face the way he always read it, not waiting for her to explain, but already paying attention to what was already there. "Hackett's leaving," she said. He was still for a beat. "For good," he said. "Selling everything," she said. "Going back east." He looked at her steadily. "How do you feel?" She thought about it. She gave it a real answer instead of an efficient one. "Like something I've been holding is finished," she said. Not relieved exactly, something quieter than that. She paused. "Like the ground is solid. Like I can just stand on it. Without checking whether it'll hold." "It'll hold," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what's different." He came through the gate and stood beside her, in the way he stood beside her, close enough to be present. Spaced the way two people stood when they were comfortable with each other's gravity. She had noticed, over the months, that the distance between them had changed not dramatically. Not in any single moment, but incrementally, the way all real changes happened. One small adjustment at a time until you looked up one day and found yourself somewhere entirely different from where you'd started. "There's something I want to say," she said. "Say it," he said. She had been thinking about how to say it for weeks. She had drafted it in her mind the way she drafted letters, carefully. Precisely, with no unnecessary words. She had thought she needed the right moment. She had understood somewhere around the second calf that there was no right moment for the things that mattered. Just the moment you were in and the choice to use it. "You came into my barn in a storm," she said, "and you handed me a rope and you said, 'I've got you,' and you meant it in the most plain, specific, practical way, not a declaration, not a promise. Just a statement of fact. And something about the plainness of it." She stopped. Steadied. "I have spent a long time not being able to hear things like that. Not because no one said them, because I'd made myself unable to receive them." She looked at him. "I want you to know that I can hear it now. Whatever you say. However you say it. I'm not managing the distance anymore. I'm not holding anything at arm's length because I'm afraid of what it costs when it goes away." She took a breath. "I'm just here, building this." She paused. "That's the thing I wanted to say." William Carter looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You know what I appreciate about you? I assume you're going to tell me," she said. "You say the hard thing," he said, "every time. You find the hardest true thing and you say it out loud. Even when you'd rather not. Because you've decided that's how things should be done. He looked at her with the full steady attention she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things he valued. I have wanted to say something to you. Since January, he said. I've been waiting for the right time. There isn't one, she said. Just say it. I love you, he said. That's the thing. Plain and specific and with no ceremony attached. She looked at him. The creek moved behind her. The cattle moved on its bank. The Dakota Territory went about its enormous indifferent business. Exactly as it always had. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right, he said. I love you too, she said. I've known it since about the third day. I just needed everything else to settle before I could say it without it feeling like something I was falling into instead of something I was choosing. She held his gaze. I'm choosing it. He reached out and took her hand, both of his around hers. The same as the morning she'd told him, the petition was denied. The same gesture, the same held quality, and he said, Good laugh. A real one, sudden and full. You sound like my father, she said. I'll take that, he said. They stood at the north fence of her land on a late August afternoon and held on. And the land held around them, and the creek ran, and the cattle moved in the slow, deliberate way of animals that have been given what they need. She thought about the woman she'd been the night of the storm standing at his door. Soaking wet, unable to get 3 words out, terrified in the specific way of someone who has made their own isolation into a point of pride and does not know how to set it down without losing themselves in the process. She had not lost herself. She was, if anything, more herself than she had been more of the things her father had built into her. More of the things she had built herself, because she had stopped spending so much of it on the work of needing nothing. Needing nothing cost everything. Choosing something cost only the fear of losing it. And the fear of losing it was not a reason to refuse the thing. The autumn came, and the partnership produced its first formal season of results. And the results were good, better than Clara's solo projections. Better than William's, which was the particular satisfaction of 2 people who were both right about different things combining into something neither of them would have reached alone. Morrison reviewed the operating record and wrote a letter of such specific professional approval that Clara put it in the safe next to the deed. Tom Reeves came to supper in September and sat at her kitchen table and talked about the old survey days with a happiness recognized as the happiness of a man who had done something worth doing and was being allowed to revisit it. William was there too, which meant the conversation went 3 ways and ran long and covered ground from 1871 to the breeding program to the territorial water law in a range she would not have managed alone. She looked at the table, the 3 of them, the food she had made, the kitchen her father had built, and she felt something she had felt only a few times in her life. Something she had no precise word for in the ledger language she used to track most things. Abundance. That was the closest. Not of money, though the operation was profitable now. Not of ease, because the work was still hard, and the winters were still brutal, and the land was still the land. Demanding and particular and occasionally merciless. Abundance of the right things in the right proportion. She had the land, she had the work. She had a man who said what he meant and meant what he said and brought biscuits in the dark, and held her rope when she needed it, and let her hold her own rope when she didn't. She had chosen all of it. That was the part her father had been trying to teach her. Not to be strong, she had come to him already strong. Not to be independent, she had learned that too early and too completely, and had had to unlearn the parts of it that were actually just fear wearing strength's clothes. What he had been trying to teach her was the thing she had finally arrived at. On the other side of a storm and a water rights fight and a falsified survey marker and a morning when she'd looked at her hand and decided she could go one more day and then looked up and found she didn't have to. Surviving is not the same as living. She had survived everything. She was living now. She picked up her coffee cup. She looked at William across the table, who was in the middle of a sentence about shorthorn crosses, and caught her looking and stopped. What? He said. Nothing, she said. Just I'm glad you're here. He looked at her the way he had looked at her that first morning. That first impossible morning when she'd stood on his porch and dripped water on his floor and couldn't say the 3 words she'd come to say. He looked at her like he was reading something true and recognizing it because it matched something he already knew. "I'm glad I'm here too," he said. Tom Reeves, with the excellent social awareness of a man who had surveyed enough territory to know when he was standing on ground that belonged to someone else, looked deeply interested in his coffee cup. Clara set her cup down and opened the ledger that she kept on the table now had moved it from the desk to the table months ago. Without really deciding to, the same way you stop keeping necessary things at a distance when you stop needing the distance. She wrote the date. She wrote the stock count. She wrote the season's figures in the careful, precise hand that her father would have recognized and approved of. Then she wrote, at the bottom of the page, in the column that had once said alone, and then said not alone, and then said choosing. Not surviving, she wrote living. 1 word. It was enough. Outside, the Dakota Territory went about its business the creek, running along her eastern boundary. The cattle settling for the night, the enormous star-scattered sky doing what it had always done. Indifferent and magnificent, and entirely unconcerned with the small human story happening beneath it. Inside, the lamp burned warm. Clara Whitmore closed the ledger. She looked at the man she loved, and the old surveyor who had given her the map that kept her land, and the kitchen her father had built with his hands. And she felt the full solid weight of everything she had chosen, and everything she had kept, and everything she had built from the ground up, by refusing through every storm. Every fight, every morning she had gotten up and gone back out to do it again, refusing to let the land win. The land had not won, she had, not because she was hard enough. Not because she had needed no one, but because she had finally understood the difference between a woman who survives alone and a woman who lives fully. And she had been brave enough, stubborn enough, her father would have said, with the particular pride he had always had in her stubbornness, to choose the second thing, even when the first one felt safer. She had run to her neighbor's door in a storm. She had whispered 4 words she hadn't known she needed to say. And the life that had been waiting for her on the other side of that door, the full, chosen, built with both hands life had been there all along, waiting for her to arrive.